John Wilkes Booth, the man who murdered President Abraham Lincoln in cold blood, just after the end of the American Civil War, all the way back in April of 1865. April 14th, to be exact. This man's name is synonymous with cowardice, bigotry, and murder. There is very little that was any good about John Wilkes Booth. He was mean, arrogant, boastful, and in favor of some of the worst ideas humanity has ever thought of. If there is anyone out there with an overly positive opinion of John Wilkes Booth, then I suggest you rethink that idea mighty quick, because there was nothing about him that was worthy of praise. I've spent a long time trying to find something good about John Wilkes Booth, and I just can't. So I don't want to hear anyone talking him up or acting like he's some great guy. He's not. He's a piece of shit, and that's why I'm here to make a video about him.
This country was formed for the white, not the black man. And looking upon African slavery, I, for one, have ever considered one of the greatest blessings, both for themselves and us, that God ever bestowed upon a favored nation.
Throughout this video that you better not click off of, I plan on telling you everything that there is to know about John Wilkes Booth, as best as I am able. There may be mistakes, hopefully small ones, but they still might be there. Be sure to correct me in the comments down below, in as much detail as possible as well. I'm eager for the opinions of everyone watching. If I have forgotten anything, please let me know about that too. Of course, there are some things that were omitted for the sake of brevity or relevance, but if there's something that I forgot that you feel is important, let me know. Again, this video is about the life and the crimes of John Wilkes Booth, the Confederate-supporting murderer that doomed America to suffer the awful presidency of Andrew Dickhead Johnson. That's his real name, look it up. And I'm going to make my case for exactly why that is later on in this video, so be sure to stick around. But before we get started, I want to clarify that I did not make this video to glorify John Wilkes Booth. Far from it, actually. I chose him because I'm new to creating videos like this, and I wanted to make sure that the first person I covered was someone that I could take a big old shit on if I wanted to, which I very much do. And I wanted to be able to do that without anyone caring too much about what I say. So John Wilkes Booth is the perfect target. I know there are some people out there who have some misguided soft spots for John Wilkes Booth, but honestly, I don't care about their feelings. If they're so sensitive about John Wilkes Booth that they can't handle a few jokes and a few unironic direct insults to the name and miserable reputation of a man dead some 150 years, then really I just can't care. I just can't. If that's too much for you to bear, then, well, you can kiss my unusually hair-free ass. I want to talk about history, and I plan to do it my way. Full of unfunny jokes and middle school poop humor whenever I think of a good way to try to do it, because that's how I roll, baby. But it's all in good fun, right, guys? I mean, we're all just having a good time, aren't we? Yeah, of course we are. Thanks for that enthusiastic, positive response. So sit back and relax while I regale you with a long, drawn-out story about John Wilkes Booth, the first ever presidential assassin to make their unwanted mark on American history, but certainly not the last. So without any further bloviating and beating around the bush, let's get into the childhood of John Wilkes Booth, where we will find many possible answers to the question of what caused John Wilkes Booth to go from a semi-respected, financially successful actor to a rotting corpse and one of the biggest villains of American history.
Oh, way down south in the land of traitors, rattlesnakes and alligators. Right away, come away, right away, come away. Where cotton's king and men are chattels, Union boys will win the battles. Right away, come away, right away, come away. We'll all go down to Dixie, away, away. Each Dixie boy must understand that he must mind his upper Sam.
John Wilkes Booth was born May 10th, 1838, as the 9th child of 10 that were born to Junius Brutus Booth and his longtime mistress and second wife, Mary Ann Holmes. Junius had 2 other children as well, with his first wife. And out of the 10 children Junius and Mary Ann had together, 6 of them survived to adulthood, counting John Wilkes himself. John Wilkes was the second youngest of the whole bunch. Only Joseph Adrian was younger. Going up the list, 8th in line would have been Asia Frigga, 7th would have been Edwin Thomas, then Elizabeth, then Frederick, then Mary Ann, who was named after her mother, then Henry Byron, Rosalie Ann, and then finally Junius Brutus Jr., who was the eldest of the Booth children, plus the aforementioned kids that Junius had with his first wife. John Wilkes was born into a wealthy family that owned multiple houses. They owned a townhouse in Baltimore, and they had the farmhouse in Bel Air, which was a successful farm that was being run and operated by rented slave labor. Basically, John Wilkes was born on a farm that is just like Tara in Gone with the Wind. It might not have been quite as fancy, but it's still a pretty close comparison, I think. And then when John and his family moved into Tudor Hall in his teens, actually the same year that his father Junius died, in 1852, John really was living a high-class antebellum South lifestyle in a massive Civil War-era house, and it was not too far away from the 150-acre farm where John grew up. So when it came to property, the Booth family was pretty much ballin', like, no doubt about it. It's true that John did not live in Tudor Hall for all that long, about 4 years or so, because by 1856 the Booth family had moved out of Tudor Hall and began renting it out to another family. But that doesn't mean that they were living in squalor after they moved out of Tudor Hall. They just shifted around their living arrangements. But let's get back on track. The relationship that John had with his father was very troubled and turbulent, and he had an intense rivalry with his brothers, but John Wilkes was still a generally happy, carefree child. There was no real pressure on him for much of anything. He didn't have to work out in the fields like poor children would have had to do, and he was able to have a free reign around the property that he lived on. He would run around on horses, playing in the fields around his home, pretending to be a soldier in the Mexican-American War. John's relationship with his father was also a significant factor in creating the monster that John Wilkes would later turn into. There is simply no doubt that the seeds of who John would later become were planted during his childhood, and John's father, Junius Brutus Booth Sr., was the one who turned the earth and watered the soil. So, as you can imagine, having 10 children, and 5 of them being sons, means that the parents are only going to have so much time and attention to split up between the kids. Junius Sr. was notorious for playing favorites with his kids. Plus, Junius was basically never around because of his work. So John Wilkes, as the second youngest son, didn't have much hope of getting the approval and attention he so desired from his father. Junius was more worried about his own problems than anything else. And what little time he did have away from the theater, well, that was spent with Edwin and Henry Byron before he died. John Wilkes and Joseph Adrian were basically left out in the cold when it comes to their father. Their mother was always affectionate and caring, but that's just not quite the same, is it? Junius Jr., on the other hand, well, he had already grown up and moved out of the house by the time John was old enough to care about his father's approval. So who knows for sure if Junius Jr. felt the same way as the other kids. Maybe not. When Henry Byron died 5 years before John was born, it devastated Junius Sr. in a big way. And not long before that, 3 of his other children died as well, all around the same time and all from sickness. So when Junius came out of his drunken stupor of madness and depression, Edwin was the one that he favorited, and Junius basically ignored John Wilkes for most of his life after that. Junius saw himself as a genius, and he thought that he was the ultimate judge of character in his children, so when he went to go see which of his kids had the same gifts that he did for the theater, Junius found John lacking, and because of that, he basically ignored John. There is a story that was portrayed by Drunk History.
John Wilkes, stay back, man. Stay away. Because you're not cool. Stop. You're kind of weird. You're weirding everybody out. Just back away.
This scene is supposed to take place in a photography shop somewhere, where Junius Sr. basically shoos an 8-year-old John Wilkes out of the photo for seemingly no good reason. That event is very telling of what Junius might have been like to John Wilkes. I'm sure that Drunk History's depiction of these events are probably not completely accurate, but this event was definitely based in reality. The occasion that they're depicting and Junius's mistreatment of John Wilkes as a young child probably did happen. Junius would not argue or talk things out. He would simply clam up and go quiet, or he would just walk away. And that right there is nothing short of pathetic, in my opinion.
One of the things he would do with his kids would just turn totally stone cold. He would shun you until you came to heel. And with those actor eyes of his, he could bore a hole in a child. He could be intimidating. He could be loving, but he could also be intimidating as a parent.
He would basically do the silent treatment to his own kids and to other people. Just like a big baby with no emotional intelligence whatsoever. How can you call yourself a genius when that's how you communicate? And we have not even begun to talk about the insane bouts of madness and depression that Junius would go through regularly.
Sometimes he was drunk, but sometimes he seems to have been genuinely out of his mind. His fits of madness were apparently exacerbated by his drinking, and unfortunately nobody could stop him from drinking.
Junius's mental health was so bad and so volatile that Edwin had to be pulled out of boarding school, which was not a punishment back then, so he could travel with his father wherever he went for many years, just to babysit the drunken lunatic and make sure the old fool didn't try to jump off a ship again, like he did during one of his earlier fits of madness. Junius was basically the only real source of income for the Booth family, besides the 150-acre farm that they had being run by slaves. So when things were going well, they had a decent income. But without Junius's theater money and having 10 kids at home, many of them going to boarding school and pursuing their own interests, there's no way the income from the Booth farm would have sustained the whole family. So it's safe to say that there was a lot of responsibility resting on the skinny shoulders of Edwin Thomas Booth. The whole family was depending on Edwin, and they didn't even really realize it. But the ancillary benefit to Edwin's role as babysitter was that he would gain a first-class acting education in the process. Something that none of the other Booth children would get, even though 3 of the 4 Booth brothers would become actors. Somehow, only Edwin ended up with the first-class training. So it is kind of hard to determine who was the most fortunate of the bunch. Edwin had to give up his childhood to care for their drunken father, but the acting education he received in the process led to a life of fabulous wealth and fame far beyond anything John Wilkes would ever experience. On the other hand, John had an idyllic, carefree childhood where he didn't have much to worry about at all, other than the usual worries teenagers would have during his time. So Edwin and John are looking at each other's lives with envy. John wished that he could be brought along with his father and get the same level of approval that Edwin got. And Edwin wished that he could have a more normal childhood without so much stress and responsibility at such a young age. Honestly, neither of them are completely wrong for wanting what the other had. Their father, Junius, should have been much more fair to all of his children. There's no doubt about that. I'm sure that if you were to ask Edwin if he was happy with his childhood, he would have complained endlessly about the hardships that he had to deal with back then. But it's my opinion that John was the one to get the short end of the stick in this situation. Sure, John had a worry-free childhood, but that's what ultimately ended up turning John into the attention-seeking murderer that would do anything for fame. So the worry-free childhood certainly didn't do John any favors. If John Wilkes had received more positive reinforcement from his father when he was a child, perhaps he might not have been so obsessed with proving himself to everyone later on. But that's just my opinion, though. I'm not a psychologist or a therapist. I'm just, speculating. It just makes sense to me that if John Wilkes had had more positive reinforcement as a kid, he likely would not have resorted to murdering the President of the United States in an attempt to gain fame and admiration from the South. But I do believe that we are all products of our environments and circumstances. I could go all day speculating about what might have been, but there's no real point in doing that. I do think it's safe to say, however, that the rivalry between John Wilkes and Edwin Thomas was a significant factor in pushing John Wilkes towards the path he took. I mean, honestly, we could go all day talking about what might have caused John Wilkes to become the shithead that he was. And we will never actually find a concrete answer one way or the other. Because this all happened so damn long ago that there is simply no way to know for sure. All we can do is read the letters that we have from back then and try to figure out what makes the most sense. To me, John Wilkes was a pampered, spoiled brat that was arrogant enough to go off the deep end after being ignored by his father and outshined by his brother. And then, when you add the experiences John had at boarding school, you end up with a recipe for a radicalized, deeply bigoted, Confederate Christian nationalist who thought slavery is a damn fine institution. In more simple terms, a total asshole. Just like millions and millions of John's contemporaries, who believed in the exact same ideas that John did. It's not like John Wilkes was the only one to believe the things that he believed. The ideas that he supported were very widely held across the South, which is a very depressing thing to say because John Wilkes believed in some seriously fucked up ideas.
There's no reason to think that there was anything wrong with John Wilkes Booth. He just hated Lincoln. And at a time, he was a true believer. He believed in the cause of the South. And this was a time when hundreds of thousands of American men were willing to kill and to die for what they believed in. Booth saw himself as a Southern soldier, and he saw his act as an act of war.
So let's talk about what happened while he was at school. John Wilkes began attending boarding school in 1846 at the Bel Air Academy, also known as the Harford County Academy, where he attended school with his younger brother, Joseph Adrian. Joseph was a better student than John Wilkes ever was, and John didn't actually spend the night there at the school like Joseph did. He was what was called a day student and would come back and forth from home to the school, because he just really wasn't that good of a student. John's time at the Bel Air Academy was not the most crucial part to forming his later beliefs, because the children there were so young and unaware of the goings-on in the world. It was in 1849, when he had graduated from the Bel Air Academy, when he was 11, that he began going to school at the Milton Boarding School in Cockeysville, Maryland, as well as St. Timothy's Hall in Cantonsville, Maryland, a military-focused academy for boys, in a state that was very sympathetic to the South, ending his formal education in 1853 when he was 15 years old. But I can tell you right now that John learned a whole lot in those 4 years, and not just academically, because again, he really wasn't that good of a student. What he learned there was something much more important: his political identity. John discovered that he wanted to be a Southern gentleman while he was at school. Throughout the time that John was in school, there was a large and ever-expanding secessionist movement and a whole lot of rhetoric and warmongering. Anyone going to a school that was located in a slave state during the 1850s would have found it near impossible to ignore the Southern sympathizers' rhetoric and warmongering. And Maryland was a hotbed of Southern sympathy in the decade leading up to the Civil War, which is why President Lincoln came down so hard on Maryland when the war started. The only way to keep Maryland from seceding from the Union was by inflicting harsh and decisive force upon its populace, all because of how strong Confederate support was across Maryland. Suspending habeas corpus and declaring martial law, that was some serious shit, and just straight up wrong, in my opinion. As I keep saying, we're products of our environments, and John's environment was a hotbed of Confederate sympathy. The South had been riling itself up for years before the start of the Civil War, and tensions were high as hell while John was going to school.
They'll just turn and run every time.
One Southerner can lick 20 Yankees.
Why, we'll finish him in one battle. Gentlemen can always fight better than rattle.
Yes, gentlemen always fight better than rap.
Actually, it was John's generation that was like the bulk of the fighting age men when the Civil War broke out. So John Wilkes was there for pretty much all of it, right from the beginning with the Compromise of 1850, the set of laws that introduced the hated and miserable fugitive slave laws, all the way to the very bitter end of the Civil War when the treaty was signed at Appomattox. John learned to care about politics while he was in school in the early 1850s, and he learned right then that he wanted to support the South. And these feelings were reinforced later on when John became an actor and could not find success up north because of the snooty attitudes of northern theater goers and his decidedly subpar acting skills. And when he went south, the people loved him there. So, from John's point of view, the South was always welcoming to him. So yeah, like I said, John learned to care about politics while he was in school. All while John is paying attention to the developing Civil War throughout the rest of the 1850s. He finished school at 15, and he spent a few years screwing around at home with his buddies. And at 17, he decided to follow in his father and two brothers' footsteps to become an actor. John Wilkes Booth's acting career is nothing to get excited about. Technically speaking, he was a subpar actor. He was very prone to screwing up lines and making simple errors that no properly trained thespian actor would ever make. Everyone who was involved with the theater, and pretty much anyone who attended theater regularly, were all very well versed in Shakespeare.
From his childhood, John Wilkes Booth was immersed in the theater, and particularly in the tragedies of Shakespeare.
So these mistakes were not something to just be overlooked, especially in northern theaters, where the best stage actors of the time usually spent their days. Theater critics in many northern cities had a field day critiquing John Wilkes Booth. Listen to this short excerpt from a wonderful podcast I found where they discuss John's acting career in depth.
And his performance on stage was enough to embarrass Edwin.
He was a terrible actor. I mean, that just has to be said, right? Yes. He was just terrible.
The newspapers of the 19th century, theater critics delighted in coming up with ways to talk about how John Wilkes Booth murdered scripts and disastrously performed. They really talked about his lack of elocution. John Wilkes sounded like a kid who grew up on the streets of Baltimore. John Wilkes mispronounces many words, which he articulates distinctly. There is no possible excuse to be found for saying toe instead of two, untrals for entrails, humanity for humanity, or for turning Henry into Henry. These errors in style are grievous, and they are not trivial. And he compounded this by hurting his fellow actors, so he would never learn his lines. So in order to generate excitement on stage, he would improvise a lot of physical violence. He would just substitute frenzied sword fighting while kind of roaring out the words of the monologue as he remembered them.
John Wilkes tried to compensate for his lack of elocution, or rather his inability to speak his lines accurately, with an overzealous rowdiness on stage. Instead of trying to bring meaning to the audience with the words of the play, John Wilkes would try to wow the audience with acrobatics and borderline dangerous sword fights that would often result in many injuries of fellow actors.
His brutal fight scenes injured fellow players. His distraught Romeo ripped Juliet's hair out by the roots. His violent Richard III knocked an actor into the orchestra pit.
If John Wilkes had lived in the modern day, where lawsuits are commonplace, he would have been booted out of the industry real quick, because no one wants to be dealing with injuries on set.
John Wilkes Booth was certainly best known for acting in very violent, bloody plays, which concentrated on sword fights, on murders, on assassinations. It's clear that Booth's professional life was centered around the depiction of murder and murder in a theater. And on several occasions, John Wilkes Booth was cut on the head, and he would continue to fight with blood streaming down his face.
In short, John Wilkes Booth's acting career is one that has been massively overvalued. I think this is because, for some reason, people want John Wilkes to seem bigger than he was. If President Lincoln was murdered by the best actor in America, the story sounds more interesting. Mr. Beat is one of the most successful creators I've seen making this mistake. Mr. Beat compares John Wilkes Booth to Matthew McConaughey, and I simply do not agree with that assessment at all.
Booth was basically the Matthew McConaughey of his day.
No, not quite.
It's not a big deal. I just disagree, that's all. Matthew McConaughey is at the very tippy top of the acting echelons in modern-day Hollywood, and John Wilkes Booth could only ever dream of being on a similar ladder of the acting hierarchy as Matthew McConaughey. John's older brother Edwin was certainly at the top echelons of skill and reputation as an actor, but John Wilkes Booth was not. He was more of a B-rated actor.
You're a fine tragedian, John. But you'll never be as great as your father.
If John Wilkes had heard of anyone comparing him to the best actors that we have today, he would be overjoyed to hear about it. So you're kind of giving him what he wants by equating him with someone who is truly great. But back to the main subject at hand. John Wilkes Booth began acting around the age of 17, and he was well and done with acting by the time he was 26. For the final 8 months of John's life, his heart was no longer in acting. He didn't really care about it too much. So I guess you can say that he tried acting for about 5 years, and then he gave up on it. Maybe he realized that he was simply not cut out for the stage, since he continued to make grammatical errors with his line deliveries and his elocution right up until the very end. He never wanted to practice, and he never really cared about improving his skills as an actor. He only ever really cared about boosting his reputation and increasing his fame.
John was not known for preparing well. In fact, there's a story about him pacing up and down the floor of his Philadelphia boarding house while he was with the Arch Street Stock Company, marching up and down saying, "I must have fame, fame," and his friends all wondered how he was going to get it if he didn't work for it.
There is no doubt that John was a financially successful actor during his time, but you also have to remember that John was at his peak during the Civil War, when the majority of men his age were off fighting and dying in the war. Theaters just did not have many options for leading men during that time, especially tall, good-looking ones like John Wilkes Booth. Many of the potential actors that John would have been competing against were in the army, or they were dead, or they were doing some kind of wartime occupation that was more useful than acting. So you can believe that John had a prosperous time during the war. But, of course, the guilt started getting to him, and by 1864, John was plotting ways that he could make himself useful to the Southern cause. And you can believe that John Wilkes Booth took advantage of being one of the few men around town while all of the other men were off fighting. You know what that means, baby. John Wilkes Booth got his freak on with a whole bunch of girls that would have otherwise been with better men, if only they weren't off to war. Instead of calling him John Wilkes Booth, we should call him Jody Wilkes Booth. Hanging of John Brown. In 1859, when John Wilkes's acting career was just starting to pick up steam, John Wilkes Booth caught wind of a raid on Harper's Ferry by a man who goes by the name of John Brown. If you're an American, you should probably have at least a general idea of who John Brown is. He was probably one of the most well-known and pivotal abolitionists of the entire Civil War era. Basically, the whole country was paying close attention to John Brown when he was arrested and put on trial for his failed raid at Harper's Ferry. Many did support John Brown, but many others hated him with a passion. And at the time of the hanging, public discourse was very much shifted away from John Brown. People were angry and upset and worried that John Brown's actions were going to spark a civil war, which, of course, they would. If you don't know who John Brown is, you soon will, because I will be making a video about him either after this video or after the next one. But he will be very soon on the list of videos to make. The short version is that John Brown was a staunch abolitionist and an absolute wild man who was willing to put his money where his mouth was whenever he felt strongly about the task at hand, unlike most politically active people today. I mean, I'm no different. John Brown did not give a fuck. That's what I'm saying.
What if I told you
John Brown
had that dog in him?
When it came time for action, John motherfucking Brown did not hesitate. He tried his damnedest to start a slave revolt in Harper's Ferry in West Virginia. Well, it was Virginia at the time, but it wouldn't be long until there was an uprising and a little war of their own to create West Virginia. John Brown gathered up some weapons and some accomplices to get started with, and then they released some slaves, and they swelled their numbers a little bit, and they took control of some key buildings in Harper's Ferry. Eventually, John Brown's gang found themselves trapped in an armory building, and from there, it didn't take long for the whole scheme to come crashing down around John Brown's ears. Brown was cornered by Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was in command at the time, as well as Jeb Stuart and Stonewall Jackson and their troops. Of course, this is all before the war, long before anyone knew who Stonewall Jackson was or who J.E.B. Stuart was, and I'm sure Robert E. Lee was popular back then, but, not nearly as much. The uprising that John Brown tried to start was put down before it could even begin, and John Brown was captured and put on trial. He was sentenced to death by hanging soon after. This whole event was one of, if not the first major event to be covered as extensively as it was by media at the time. And they made damn good use of the telegraph to communicate between reporters and publications. The whole nation was watching. It was one of those moments where everyone living at the time knew where they were when John Brown raided Harper's Ferry. And the telegraph meant that updates would be happening frequently throughout the country. John Brown's trial and his execution might have been the first big story to take up the country's entire attention. So it was a big deal. And John Wilkes Booth was aware of all of this, as he was very invested in the politics of America in 1859. John Wilkes saw just how electrifying John Brown's actions were to the abolitionist movement in America. I mean, sure, John Wilkes hated the abolitionists, but he knew a good idea when he saw one. He knew that John Brown was onto something. I have no doubt that John Wilkes wanted his own actions to have a similar effect on the country as what John Brown's actions had. Just that John Wilkes wanted it to be in a way that benefits the South and the institution of slavery, whereas John Brown wanted to dismantle that very system. So John Wilkes and John Brown were on polar opposite ends of the political spectrum at the time. When it was announced that volunteers were needed to help guard John Brown's execution, John Wilkes Booth jumped at the opportunity to play soldier. Of course, he was not just playing around. He was actually paid by the unit that he was with. John Wilkes got a check for $64.58 by the Richmond Greys for his service. But let's not kid ourselves. He didn't exactly do a whole tour of duty. I'm not exactly sure how the timing worked, because John Brown was executed December 2nd, 1859, and John Wilkes broke ranks with the Greys not long after the execution was carried out. Of course, $64 wasn't really that much to John Wilkes Booth, as he had very expensive tastes, and he made quite a lot of money with his acting, but him joining the Richmond Greys really wasn't about money. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing that he did for the sake of adventure and to feel like he was contributing to the Southern cause. To join the Richmond Greys, he had to borrow pieces of the Richmond Greys uniform from various members of the unit. One guy give him a hat, one guy give him an extra shirt, another guy give him a pair of pants, and by the time it's all done, John Wilkes would have a full outfit. He would serve as a guard for the hanging, making sure that no abolitionist gang would show up to try to free John Brown. The whole affair was pretty uneventful, in all honesty. There was little excitement for Booth and the Richmond Greys, because the only people seeing any excitement in the area were the roaming bands of Southern sympathizers that were stringing up any abolitionists that they found in the area. Any organized abolitionist resistance would have been overwhelmed by the hordes of angry Southern sympathizers who were out in force on the day of John Brown's execution. My voice just cracked, and I don't want to say that whole line over again. Honestly, there were more reporters at the hanging of John Brown than there were any other type of person. They were all transcribing what they saw for publication in newspapers all over the country. because America had a insatiable appetite for news on John Brown's execution. And John Wilkes Booth wanted to be at the center of it all. He wanted to be where the action was. And he figured that joining the Richmond Greys was the best way that he could get close to the action. This all took place in what was then plain old Virginia, the beating heart of the Confederacy. So the people attending the hanging were almost all pro-slavery and would not have tolerated any abolitionist gangs or any real resistance of any kind, or even a single outspoken abolitionist. Anyone attending John Brown's hanging would have been wise to keep their misgivings quiet, because tensions were high and life was dirt cheap back then. People got killed all the time for very slight offenses back then. Of course, later on, Harper's Ferry and Charleston, and much of Virginia, would fight their own war to become their own state, and they would side with the Union. But at the time of John Brown's hanging, the abolitionists wisely made themselves scarce. So it's not like John Wilkes Booth and the Richmond Greys had to put down vicious riots or anything like that. They were there to posture up and look good for the pictures and the newspapers. Even with there being no action at all in this experience for John Wilkes, it was still massively impactful for him. I suspect that the hanging of John Brown was a pivotal moment for John Wilkes. He was impressed by the dedication and the zeal that John Brown had for his cause. Even though John Wilkes was on the complete opposite end of the political spectrum as John Brown, he could still appreciate the effect that John Brown had on the country. And I believe this is where John Wilkes Booth got the idea to go after Abraham Lincoln. He might not have arrived at Lincoln right away, and he definitely was not settled on murder right away, but after John Brown's hanging, John Wilkes began to think in terms of, how can I make a big difference in one fell swoop? And how can I do it in a way that captures the country's attention like John Brown did? It would be another 5 years until John Wilkes would make his move, but make his move he would, and the country would suffer dearly for it. So yeah, John Wilkes Booth spent a couple of weeks in the company of the Richmond Greys, right up until the hanging was over with. And then John Wilkes Booth took off his uniform, and he went back to pursuing his acting career. It would take another 6 years for John's ambitions to come to fruition. But there is no denying the significance of John Brown's hanging in the mind of John Wilkes Booth. In fact, I think you could call John Wilkes a bit of an imitator of John Brown. But that's really an argument of semantics more than anything else. All we can say for sure is that John Wilkes Booth was very influenced by John Brown. This chapter was added at the last minute because I realized that I never really talked about this. John Wilkes Booth had many girlfriends throughout his life. Looks-wise, he's probably considered around average by today's standards. People in general have become more and more good-looking as time went on and medicine got better, but for the time John Wilkes lived in, he was about as good-looking as they get. And he was probably with about as many girls as any decent-looking guy in their 20s today, even though he was really good-looking. And John Wilkes Booth was considered an ultra-giga-chad with the ladies. People back then simply did not have sex the way we do now, obviously. And what little sex they did have was complete fucking trash. I'll bet that John Wilkes was trash in bed too, just like all the rest of the white men back then, especially uptight southern aristocrats like John Wilkes. They were all too prim and proper to get down and dirty with their ladies. Women wanted to be with John Wilkes because of how he looked and because of the status that he had within society, not because he knew what he was doing in the sheets. I can almost guarantee that. I'll bet you that John Wilkes was as selfish and boring of a lover as you could ever imagine. That's just my speculation, though, to be honest. Just based on his personality and how selfish he was in life, I doubt very seriously that John Wilkes was very generous in the sheets. But anyway, that's besides the point. The most famous girlfriend that John Wilkes Booth was known to have was a girl by the name of Lucy Hale. She was the daughter of New Hampshire's senator named John Parker Hale. who was an abolitionist senator who spent much of his time in Washington, D.C. And he brought his daughter Lucy along with him to socialize and probably to expand his political options a little bit too, knowing how people used marriages as like a political tool back then. So Lucy Hale and John Wilkes lived within the same area, because John Wilkes spent a whole bunch of time within Washington, D.C. We know now from reading letters that John Wilkes Booth and Lucy Hale had been seeing each other on the down low. It was a well-kept secret at the time. They did indeed have a clandestine relationship with each other. It's unknown whether or not Lucy Hale and John Wilkes actually did the deed or not. I suspect that they probably did, though, because I don't see John Wilkes hanging on to a girl for 3 whole years without getting some ass, at least some of the time. But I could be wrong about that, too. I mean, maybe guys back then were just natural simps. I don't know. Don't go labeling me now just because I used that term. John Wilkes had way too many other options out there for him to not get the poom-poom. But it is certainly possible that Lucy Hale never slept with John Wilkes. I just don't buy it. Like, of course Lucy Hale would have never admitted that publicly, but if they're seeing each other for 3 whole years, come on now. They would have done at least something. And there's no denying that Lucy Hale liked him a whole fuck of a lot, because she met with him quite often and wrote to him even more. And it's not like this was a one-sided affair. They were both very fond of each other, and they wrote to each other often. And I'll bet you if John Wilkes never threw his life away, he would have pursued Lucy Hale all the way to marriage, if her father would have allowed it, which I doubt he would have. But John Wilkes died before anything could really happen between him and Lucy. And I doubt very seriously that Lucy Hale had any idea of what John Wilkes' political views were. I'll bet you that John Wilkes put on a character, put on a face, whenever he went to talk to Lucy Hale. Her father was an abolitionist senator, and if John Wilkes had gone around talking about how much he supported slavery, I doubt very seriously that Lucy Hale would have been interested. Unless she was just the rebellious type that wanted to talk to her father's political enemies. I don't know. Could be, but I doubt it. So I tend to think that John Wilkes was putting on an act whenever he was with Lucy Hale, which is reasonable enough to assume he was an actor by trade. At the very end, John Wilkes died with a picture of Lucy Hale in his pocket, so that has to count for something. Whether he was putting on an act with her or not, I'm sure John Wilkes had some serious feelings towards Lucy Hale. Though, it does have to be said, John Wilkes here did have 5 other photos of other women in his pocket when he was killed. He was spinning plates just like the rest of us. The other girls that John Wilkes dated were less distinguished than Lucy Hale, but I'm sure that they were all attractive for their day. Many of John Wilkes' girlfriends were fellow actresses, and I'm sure that those actresses loved how the crowds cooed and awed over how pretty John Wilkes' face was. There were 4 actresses who were known to have had entanglements with John Wilkes. There was Helen Western, Maggie Mitchell, Effie Gurman, Fanny Brown, and Alice Gray were all known girlfriends of John Wilkes, and they were all actresses. They varied in fame and success, but they were all publicly known and talented in their own right. John Wilkes had lesser-known girlfriends as well, girls that he would spend an evening with and never see again. You know, today's version of a long-term relationship. If you're good-looking, that is. But let's talk about Lucy Hale again for a second. Lucy Hale's picture was found in John's pocket when he died, like I mentioned earlier. And there were more than a few people who knew about the relationship that Lucy and John had. But for some reason, no one ever really said anything to Lucy after President Lincoln was murdered, as far as I know. The cops never came to see her, even during the height of the pursuit, and no one ever thought to speak to Lucy Hale. I mean, this could be perhaps because her father was a senator on the winning side, and no one was willing to publicly connect Lucy Hale with John Wilkes. Or perhaps the investigators thought that John Wilkes was carrying a picture of Lucy because he was some kind of ultra fan or stalker of hers. That's perfectly possible. Maybe they thought that he was just, looking at Lucy's picture because he found her cute or something like that. It's not clear what the investigators were thinking when it came to Lucy Hale. or if they were even thinking about her at all. I don't really think so, because they never questioned her and they never really talked to her. And Lucy herself was certainly not going to say anything if she didn't have to. I'm sure she just wanted to keep her head down and make sure that no one tied her to John Wilkes publicly. Lucy probably realized how dangerous it was to be connected to the president's murderer, and she probably chose to make sure that she never gave anyone a reason to think that she was upset or concerned about John Wilkes. Or maybe she was a bawling wreck. I don't know. But we are getting ahead of ourselves quite a bit here now, aren't we? The point of this section is this. John Wilkes Booth had a very active love life that started at an early age. He was very good looking, and he had plenty of women chasing after him at any given moment. But John Wilkes would always go after the women who played a little bit hard to get. After he became prolific on the stage, and his face actually began to be recognized, John Wilkes gathered quite a lot of attention from female theater goers.
He was exceedingly good looking. Women could not resist him. He had wonderful dark eyes and a beautiful melodious voice, and that was his stock in trade.
Women began to refer to him as the most handsome man on stage, and he was even swarmed by a crowd of women after a show one time. The stage door was sometimes blocked with women trying to get a look at John Wilkes. They called him a quote-unquote sad-faced, handsome boy, and they tried their best to get a hug or a kiss out of John Wilkes as he left his dressing room for the night. But this attention would only last for so long, and his poor acting skills would start to undermine his excellent looks. But there is no denying that John Wilkes was certainly revered for his looks by many women, and there would be quite a few women thinking of John Wilkes well after he died. There was even one occasion where a woman named Miss Beckett from Richmond, Virginia, had most of her hair cut off, and she made a gift of it to John Wilkes, and John would end up using that hair as part of a wig for stage performances. Unfortunately, Miss Beckett would die from typhus not long after giving the hair to John Wilkes, and this was sometime during 1860. John Wilkes Booth would have been the Alpha Chad of Alpha Chads if only he had reined in his political opinions. If he was not on the losing side and on the completely wrong side of history, then John Wilkes' reputation with women at the time would have stayed very high indeed for a very long time. But because he supported the dumbest, most offensive ideas that he could find, towards the end of the war, he eventually became somewhat of an outcast, albeit a very good-looking one that many women would happily sleep with, and even marry if they had the chance. But by the time John Wilkes died, he was no longer the cool ladies' magnet that he used to be. His public image had suffered quite a bit throughout the Civil War. John Wilkes Booth was born into the generation that made up the bulk of the Civil War's fighting men. Anyone aged 16 to probably 35 or so was under a lot of pressure to join the war and fight for a cause, especially the people who were outspoken about their political beliefs. By the time Fort Sumter was attacked in 1861, John Wilkes would have been around the age of 22. Basically the perfect age for being in the military. And yet, John Wilkes Booth never joined the Confederacy, and he never made any real moves to assist either side for the majority of the war. It was not until at least midway through 1864 that he began interacting with the Confederate spy network. So for the bulk of the war, John Wilkes Booth was idle, doing his own thing, not actually helping anyone but himself. And yet, he believed strongly in the cause of the South. He was able-bodied. He was not shy about sharing his political ideas. He was wealthy, and he was from a prominent family in a slave state. I mean, that right there is the perfect recipe for an officer in the Confederate Army. John Wilkes could have purchased a commission somewhere or started his own regiment like many other prominent citizens did, but he chose not to. Physically and mentally, compared to other officers at the time, John Wilkes Booth would have fit right in. There was no real reason for John to not join the Confederacy and put his money where his mouth was, other than him being a coward and him being greedy. The lame-ass excuse he used when people asked him why he didn't join the war was that he refused to join the war at the behest of his mother, Mary Ann Holmes. I mean, the excuse he gave people for why he didn't join the war really wasn't a very good one. He told people that his mother did not want him to join the war, and out of respect for her, he obeyed. But I call bullshit on that excuse because his mother didn't count for shit when he was thinking about murdering the president, and I doubt very seriously his mother's word counted for much else when it came to joining the Civil War. He was just afraid to do it, and he wanted to make more money as an actor. He wanted to stay home and be Jody Wilkes Booth. I mean, John would go around claiming that his mother begged him to not join the Confederacy, when really it was just a letter one time that his mother wrote asking him to not join. And because of it, John Wilkes Booth never joined the military, and the feeling of idleness within him only grew. He was too afraid to fight in the war, and he used his mother as an excuse to stay out of the fighting. That's the simple version of what I think happened. John Wilkes Booth was a big old chicken, and he would have never joined the army, even if his mother gave her full blessing. He would have found a different excuse if he couldn't use his mom. John Wilkes probably could have made the argument that he was more useful to the Confederacy as a civilian because he could go back and forth across battle lines, but that's not the angle that John Wilkes went with. He stuck with the whole, "My mom told me not to" excuse, and so I judge him heavily for it. Because if John Wilkes had joined the Confederacy, the country might have been spared a whole lot of pain and misery. Obviously, this lame-ass excuse did not stop anyone from picking on John Wilkes for being a coward. He would spend hours barking about the righteousness of the South, how evil Lincoln was for this or for that, how the Union was the aggressor, and how the South was just defending themselves. All of the typical Confederate sympathizer arguments. John knew all of it well, and he could recite all kinds of Confederate talking points and whataboutisms to pretty much anyone that would listen in any bar that he went to. John Wilkes Booth was not a quiet person, and he was not above bragging. He would spend hours repeating Confederate propaganda horse shit to pretty much anyone who would listen, in taverns, in bars, and theaters all over the country. That's what he did during the Civil War. He talked a bunch of shit, and he got rich doing theater, profiting off of the people's desperate need to escape the horrors of war for just a little while. When the soldiers were out fighting and dying, John Wilkes spent a whole lot of time screwing lonely Confederate women while their husbands were out in the killing fields. We should call him Jody Wilkes Booth instead. Did I make that joke earlier? And he would spend his off time talking shit to pretty much anyone who would listen. And there was never a shortage of listeners for a guy like John Wilkes. He would brag and boast about his minimal, very boring involvement with the Confederate spy network, and these hangers-on would listen with rapt attention. A tall, strong, handsome, famous, wealthy, charismatic, bigoted, radical lunatic like John Wilkes would have had plenty of minions trying to hang out with him. Social climbers that had nothing better to do. People who saw John Wilkes as this greater-than-life figure who deigned to hang out with the little people. Do not get me wrong, though. John Wilkes was not that big of a hotshot. No one of any real reputation would have been giving John Wilkes the time of day. But he would have had no trouble enthralling a band of cutthroat losers with no real social standing. Basically, John Wilkes was a loudmouth coward. He wanted to be able to brag about being a Confederate big shot without having to serve in the bloody nightmare battles of the Civil War. John Wilkes also had some business ventures towards the end of the Civil War. The main thing that he tried to do was co-founding an oil drilling company out in the Pennsylvania oil fields, where much of America's oil is still pulled from today. The company was called Dramatic Oil in the beginning, and John's involvement was advertised a little bit to try to bring in more investors. The Dramatic Oil Company created one successful oil well. They called it Wilhelmina in honor of Thomas Mere's wife. He was one of the co-founders that brought the idea of oil drilling to John Wilkes' attention in the first place, along with John Ellsler. Drilling started out all right. Progress was slow but steady. and the project was filled with problems from start to finish. But the well was working fine by 1863, and they were getting something like 25 barrels of oil per day for a while, which was considered a good yield for the time. But, and you knew the but was coming, Booth and his associates were not very happy with their modest yields. So they decided that they were going to try an experimental technology that involved dropping gunpowder charges into the oil well to increase the flow. But naturally, quote-unquote, shooting the well, as they call it, failed, and the dramatic oil company went belly up. When successful, shooting oil wells can lead to huge increases of production. But back then, with the oil shooting tech being in the primitive state that it was in, shooting wells led to dried up wells just as often as it increased yields. It wouldn't be until Colonel Edward A.L. Roberts invented the Roberts petroleum torpedo that shooting oil wells would really take off as a practice, and it would become more reliable as a technology. John Wilkes Booth simply missed out. That's a recurring story in the life of John Wilkes Booth. He missed out on many things, and he could have been very prosperous if he had just held on and not let his political convictions get the better of him. But that's not what happened, and there's no point in crying over spilled milk. In the end, John Wilkes and his associates completely ruined Wilhelmina, and it never gave another drop of oil after it was shot. The whole project was expensive and full of problems right from the start. So when the oil well was ruined, John Wilkes decided that he was done with the oil business. This failure led to Booth losing something like $6,000 when the oil well dried up, which would translate to something like $113,220 in today's hyperinflated money. Booth had withdrew from the oil business in November of 1864, and he left the Pennsylvania oil fields soon after, heading back to Washington, D.C. and Baltimore so he could work on his kidnapping plan. At the same time, Lincoln would win his second re-election on a platform of abolishing slavery by constitutional amendment, beating out the cowardly and arrogant George B. McClellan, thankfully. When John Wilkes Booth started getting into the oil business and still had much of his acting money, he also purchased a 1/30th share in the Boston Oil Well Company that was later called the Boltoff Oil and Mining Company. About 2 months after John's death and his disgrace, the Boltoff Oil Company would strike it big after a major oil field discovery that would end up yielding 500 barrels of oil per day, making a whole lot of investors mighty rich. And John Wilkes might have been super rich if he had just not thrown his life away and held on to his investments. But after his first oil investment failed miserably, John divested himself from the oil business, and he decided to start focusing on his scheme to kidnap President Abraham Lincoln. John Wilkes might have been one of those striking it rich, if only he had hung on for a little bit longer and been more patient with his oil wells. But if there is one thing that John Wilkes Booth lacked, it's patience. Sometime between July and November of 1864 is when John Wilkes Booth decided that he was going to try to kidnap President Abraham Lincoln. Not kill, kidnap. After returning from the Pennsylvania oil fields, with his pockets empty, he started spending most of his time in Washington, D.C., the only place where his schemes could actually have a chance of happening. Luckily for John, and sheer bad luck for the rest of the world, John Wilkes Booth had already established some ties in Washington, D.C. Ford's Theater was a common destination for John throughout the Civil War. It's well known that John Wilkes Booth collected his mail from Ford's Theater. Plus, Washington, D.C. was very close to his hometown of Bel Air, as well as Baltimore, where he spent a lot of time. D.C. was perfect in the mind of John Wilkes Booth. He would still do theater performances when he needed money, which was often, but his heart was no longer in the trade. He spent most of his time meeting people that he thought might prove useful to his plans, as well as doing low-level spy work for the Confederacy. John Wilkes would go north and purchase quinine and have it shipped down south for Confederate troops, which probably did save quite a few Confederate lives. But I'm not sure if that counts as a good thing, though, because it helped prolong the Civil War. But I guess saving lives is saving lives at the end of the day. John Wilkes made a 9-day trip to Montreal, Canada in October of 1864, and no one really knows exactly what happened on that trip. Many people suspect that John Wilkes met with a Confederate spy network while he was there, but there's no real proof one way or the other. It's unknown what was discussed, or if the spies in question knew about the plans that John Wilkes was making. Some people think that the Confederate spies directed Booth to go after Lincoln, but I don't buy that for 1 second. If the Confederacy wanted someone to go after Lincoln, they would not have sent John Wilkes Booth. No way, Jose. And the plans that John did think of honestly sucked. He was terrible as like a mission planner. So whatever John Wilkes Booth was doing in Montreal, I doubt very seriously it had anything to do with the kidnapping plan, let alone the murder. Not long after John Wilkes Booth returned from Montreal, Dr. Samuel Mudd, a well-known acquaintance of John Wilkes Booth, introduced him to John Surratt, a low-level Confederate spy who knew all kinds of people in the D.C., Maryland area. Not anyone of any real importance, though. Just thugs and drinking buddies, really. John Surratt introduced John Wilkes to Lewis Powell, Dave Harold, and George Azerodt. And John Wilkes brought in a couple of his friends from boarding school, Michael O'Laughlin and Samuel Arnold. Booth had met Dr. Mudd around the same time that he returned from Pennsylvania because he needed to buy a horse, and Dr. Mudd was nearby to help him with the whole process. John Wilkes even stayed a night in Mudd's house while they were putting together the transaction. Moving on, though, Lewis Powell was a tall, dangerous, strong as all hell, deadly Confederate soldier who had seen combat. His given name is Lewis Powell, but he signed his ironclad oath of loyalty to the Union as Lewis Payne, so he is often referred to by either name.
Fine shot with a parlor pistol.
Thank you, Mr. Powell.
Payne. It's Payne, not Powell. I ain't going by Powell no more.
Lewis Powell was honestly an ice-cold dick killer. He could be gentle at times, even funny when he was with his friends, but when it came time for violence, Lewis Payne, or Lewis Powell, whatever you want to call him, did not fuck around.
He had fought well and hard during the war. Someone who knew him said in his personal manner he was soft and gentle as a kitten, but at the same time he would have waded through blood if he had to for his cause.
Davy Harold was a pharmacist assistant at a time in history when pharmacists were basically drug dealers with no oversight whatsoever. It's not like David Harold was some kind of educated professional in his field. He was just some regular guy who happened to work for a pharmacist.
Mr. Harold, when working at the pharmacy, do you have occasion to deliver medicines to patients at the request of their physicians and with personal instructions as to the administration of the medicine?
Yes. For certain, it's a common thing. Common enough, yes.
So it's not like Dave Harold had to have some kind of education to do what he did. But that doesn't mean that the man was stupid either. History remembers Dave Harold as the impressionable young idiot that followed John Wilkes Booth all the way into hell. And that certainly is true. But Dave Harold was actually pretty clever. More clever than history remembers him. He knew the surrounding countryside like the back of his hand. And he was actually a pretty smooth talker. When Dave Harold was being questioned after he was caught, he gave the Union interrogators a run for their money, and he could talk circles around them. So I don't think that Dave Harold should be remembered as the brainless idiot that blindly followed John Wilkes Booth until his death. So perhaps we should remember him as the clever sidekick that simply did not know when to quit.
Prepare a package for Mr. Powell, the Reverend Payne, James Woodall, Mosby here, to deliver tomorrow night to Secretary of State William Seward, number 17 Madison Place, Lafayette Square.
Yes, sir. I'll do it.
Anyway, next was George Asderat, the group's least competent and least trustworthy member. George was an Austrian immigrant who ran a carriage business. He spoke decent English, but it was far from perfect. Honestly, George Asderat, from what I can tell in my research, is basically a fish out of water that landed himself on the frying pan. John Wilkes Booth made a huge mistake by including George Asderat in fucking anything, to be honest. The man was nothing but a liability to the group. Any task that George was assigned to would have inevitably ended in failure. The only real reason George was involved was because he was enthralled by John Wilkes, just like the rest of the group. They all wanted to hang out with and emulate John Wilkes Booth, and that's why they were involved with this conspiracy. And plus, John Wilkes Booth could be quite the bully when he wanted to get his way.
I do not wish. I cannot.
It is too late, George. We have, all of us, conspired together.
To capture, yeah. To kidnap. One man, not to murder.
This is an act of war, and you are stuck to it. It is a tar pit from which you cannot pull away. And when tomorrow night is through and our deed is done, we will, all of us, be known as its authors. I have seen to it. And we will be hailed as heroes.
He had no trouble in pushing these guys around, except for maybe Lewis Powell. John Surratt was the one to bring most of the group together. He was a known Confederate spy by the time Booth began assembling the kidnapping conspiracy. Before that, he was the postmaster in his hometown called Surrattsville, and he was in that post for a few years after his father died suddenly in 1862. But he lost that position when he was nearly caught red-handed for being a Confederate spy. John Surratt's mother was also involved with the kidnapping plot, at least to some degree. She had knowledge of the growing plot, and she helped facilitate the group's planning. Mary Surratt was a middle-aged divorcee who owned multiple properties in the Maryland, D.C. area, at least 2 taverns and a couple of houses, though she did have to start downsizing after her husband died in 1862. Mary Surratt's husband had debts that followed him after he died, and Mary was expected to handle all of it. So she had quite a bit on her plate, but that doesn't change that she was involved with the conspiracy. The next members of the group were Michael O'Laughlin and Samuel Arnold. Both of them were friends of John Wilkes that he met through boarding school at St. Timothy's. Actually, Michael O'Laughlin was one of the first people that Booth approached to recruit in the conspiracy, due to them being friends for so long. Michael was an engraver by trade. He knew how to make ornamental plaster work. Basically, he made fancy sculptures on plaster walls and ceilings for rich people. O'Laughlin was a veteran of the Confederate Army, but he only served for a short time before he was discharged. John Wilkes approached him to join the conspiracy, and he accepted because he was bored, really. Once Michael was recruited for the conspiracy, he moved to Washington, D.C., and John Wilkes started paying for Michael's expenses. Samuel Arnold was brought into the group much the same way as Michael O'Laughlin. John Wilkes went and found Samuel, and he convinced him to join the conspiracy. I think the main reason Sam Arnold agreed to join was because Booth was willing to pay for his expenses, and Samuel didn't have much else going on at the moment. He was unemployed and he was bored when John Wilkes approached him to join the conspiracy, just like Michael O'Laughlin. And as I said before, John Wilkes Booth, Michael O'Laughlin, and Samuel Arnold were all schoolmates from St. Timothy's Hall, a military-focused academy for boys that had a pernicious Confederate atmosphere the entire time these guys attended the school. These 3 might have been close friends throughout school, or they might not have. I don't know for sure one way or the other. All that really matters, though, is that Booth was able to convince these 2 to join his botched conspiracy, causing both of them a great deal of trouble after everything was said and done. There is also mention of some other conspirators that are not usually talked about unless it's by some conspiracy theorists who are trying to claim that Booth escaped or some other harebrained theory. But this video is already long enough as it is, and we still have a very long way to go before it's over. So how's about we refrain from talking about Henson or whoever else might have been part of the conspiracy? None of the tertiary people who might have been involved with this conspiracy were really all that important to the story overall, other than the core group of people that we've already talked about. I'm not trying to sound elitist or snooty, but it's sort of true. The people that John Wilkes Booth chose to help him would probably all have been forgotten by history if they had not been sucked into the story by the vortex that was John Wilkes Booth. So, with all of that being said, I don't see much point in spending too long talking about the pawns of this story, as callous as that sounds. John Wilkes Booth was the architect of this cowardly and poorly thought out kidnapping turned assassination, so we might as well talk about him the most. So, let's talk about the failed kidnapping attempt. I've mentioned the kidnapping plot multiple times throughout this video so far, but I have not explained what actually happened, and what John Wilkes Booth wanted to do. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now, any moment now. Before I start, if you have any ideas about John Wilkes Booth being some high-paid Confederate spy master who organized a giant 50-man conspiracy, well, get those ideas out of your head right now, you silly goose. John Wilkes Booth was not on the Confederates' payroll in any real way, beyond delivering quinine once in a while, and perhaps some intelligence delivery here and there, as we talked about in the spy work chapter. So there is no way that John Wilkes was managing or coordinating with a big 50-man conspiracy that led all the way to Jefferson Davis. That's just not true. I'm sorry to break it to you. John Wilkes made and thought of these plans completely independent of the Confederate government. John might have tried to get the Confederates to help while he was in Montreal, but I doubt anything actually came of it. High-level Confederate command would have had the political foresight at least to understand that Lincoln was better use to the Confederacy alive than dead, and they would have known how risky a kidnapping would be. There's no way that they would have signed off on the kidnapping plan that John Wilkes had, that I have still yet to describe in full detail. That's coming soon, don't worry. All I'm saying, guys, is that John Wilkes Booth was the one in control of the conspiracy. The buck stopped with him, because he was the one calling the shots, not Jefferson Davis, and not the Confederate spy ring in Montreal. The Confederates were barely aware of John Wilkes Booth. I mean, that's the consensus that I've gathered from watching and reading materials from Terry Alford, Harold Holzer, Michael Kaufman, James Swanson, and the rest of the historians that I've thanked in the description. To me, they are the authority on this subject, and if they think that John Wilkes was the one who was in control of the conspiracy, then that's how it was.
Well, first of all, Harold, you're right. It was the lone gunman, and I believe in the single bullet theory of the Lincoln assassination. The why, I think, fame, glory, ego, revenge, hatred, racism, but not on the orders of Jefferson Davis or the hierarchy of the Confederate government. I think Booth certainly had Confederate agent contacts, possibly even some money, but I don't think he was the puppet acting on orders of the Confederate high command, government, or military.
I'm glad that that's settled. Getting back on track, when it comes to the kidnapping plan, the one crucial piece of info that you need to know about this is that John Wilkes Booth was downright incompetent when it came to mission planning and tactics. And he barely had the strategical wherewithal to formulate a workable plan that would not immediately end in capture or death. He was not some criminal mastermind. He was improvising the entire time. I'm absolutely sure of it. And honestly, I don't think that John Wilkes was the one to even think of the kidnapping plan that they eventually attempted. I think one of the other members of the conspiracy thought of it. Because John Wilkes' first plan to kidnap the president was 3 different shades of stupid. It took John Wilkes and his conspiracy at least a few weeks of heavy discussion, planning, and arguing to come up with an idea on how to kidnap President Lincoln. I think this was mostly due to John Wilkes being a stubborn pain in the ass who wanted to put on a show more than he wanted to effectively pull off a kidnapping plan, as well as the whole group having to work themselves up to even attempt such a stunt. Mostly, they would meet at the Surrattsville Tavern to go over their plans. But they would also have dinner or lunch at restaurants and hotels around Washington, D.C., burning through money that John Wilkes no longer had due to his failures in the oil fields and him giving up the acting trade pretty much in general. At first, and for quite a while, John Wilkes Booth wanted to try to kidnap President Lincoln directly from Ford's Theater, in the middle of a theater performance, where there would be something like 1,000 people in the audience. How exactly would they abscond with the president, you ask? Well, that's obvious, isn't it? Well, they would do it by lowering the president down to the stage by rope and then carrying him out the back to a waiting carriage. Wow, what a great plan. Right, guys?
You are dumb. It is the exact opposite.
John Wilkes wanted to pay off the stagehands around Ford's Theater ahead of time to have them put out the lights for a few minutes so the gang could physically kidnap the 6'4" badass known as Abe Vampire Hunter Lincoln.
He offered me $3,000, and he said all I had to do was to shut off the lights in the theater, open the back door, the backstage door, while he and the others carried the president out. They were going to tie him up in a sack and then lower him to the stage, kidnap him.
And they wanted to do all of this in the pitch black of the theater, 150 years before readily available night vision technology. I don't think I have to explain just how insane and downright stupid that this plan is, or at least I shouldn't have to. Abraham Lincoln was no pushover. The man was known for wrestling, for God's sake. How the hell did these fools ever think that this plan was even remotely plausible? John Wilkes Booth was no tactician, obviously, and this plan to kidnap Lincoln from Ford's Theater is evidence of that. John Wilkes was more worried about making a good show for the country. He wanted to do whatever would lead to good newspaper headlines. So his first plans on how to go after the president were more theatrical in nature than they were tactically sound. Somehow, John Wilkes actually thought that the group had a chance of pulling off his insane, nonsense plan. I'm sure that John Wilkes was very enthusiastic when he first told the conspiracy what he wanted to do. But Samuel Arnold, or perhaps Michael O'Loughlin, one of them, finally told John Wilkes that his plan was utter madness and would never work. So, unfortunately for the rest of the world, the group decided to find an alternate way to kidnap President Lincoln. The way they thought of was to intercept President Lincoln in between Soldiers' Home and the White House. A solid enough plan, considering that the president often traveled alone on short trips throughout D.C. and its surrounding countryside. President Lincoln was nearly shot one time while he was traveling in between Soldiers' Home and the White House. A bullet went right through his top hat and took it right off his head. He had no idea if it was an assassin who missed or a hunter's stray bullet, and yet he continued to travel alone quite often. In spite of this, the man was dancing with death the whole time he was president. Anyway, it was no secret that Lincoln was sometimes vulnerable. The conspiracy planned on taking advantage of that fact. They would wait for Lincoln to be on the road by himself in an area where there were no onlookers, and they would surround him, bind his hands and legs, put a mask over his head, put him on the carriage, and drive him south across the border. As for what they planned on doing after the kidnapping, well, that's a bit less clear. They planned on taking Abraham Lincoln down south, probably off into the wilderness somewhere. Then they would send letters to the Union, demanding that they release all Confederate troops in exchange for the president. By the time the kidnapping was being planned, the war was already 90% done. They just didn't know it yet. The Union had long ago decided to stop doing prisoner exchanges. This was decided by General Grant, because doing so was helping the Confederacy more than it was helping the Union. And stopping prisoner exchanges greatly pissed off the South, because they had relied heavily on being able to get their troops back. The Union had more soldiers in reserve, and plenty of them. The Confederacy was always going to lose the war of attrition. So newspapers in the South had loudly complained about the prisoner exchanges being ended. So it's no wonder that John Wilkes had the idea to try and force the Union to do prisoner exchanges again. John's entire brain was filled with Confederate propaganda.
Richmond has fallen in a war against the Constitution, against states' rights, against Southern rights and institutions. And a malignant tyrant, a half-breed, low-mannered country buffoon is threatening to proclaim him king.
And the loss of prisoner exchanges was a huge talking point throughout the end of the war on the Southerners' side. The population of the South would have been all kinds of excited if John Wilkes had pulled off his kidnapping plan, so long as President Lincoln had come out of the ordeal alive and well, that is. Because even though the South had loved to hate President Lincoln, I think they knew deep down that Lincoln was the Confederacy's best friend in the entire Union. So even if the kidnapping was successful, if anything had happened to President Lincoln, I think John Wilkes still would have gone down in history as a villain. There really was no escaping his villainous reputation unless he had just decided to abandon all of his plans entirely. There really was no getting out of this for John Wilkes without being demonized, at least in my opinion. The group had picked a day out for when they would ambush the president. March 17th, 1865. Lincoln was supposed to see a rendition of the play Still Waters Run Deep on this particular day, which was to be performed at Campbell Hospital near Soldiers' Home, a 225-acre campus that has multiple purposes. It's a small veterans hospital and a personal retreat for the president, as well as a meeting place for officials at the time. It was used for official business many times. President Lincoln would ride his horse back and forth from the White House in D.C. to Soldiers' Home very often, even at the height of the war. So the kidnapping plan that John Wilkes and his conspiracy had thought up, well, it had some merit. And it might have actually worked if President Lincoln did not change his plans last minute. Instead of going to the performance of Still Waters Run Deep, he went to a gathering at the National Hotel. So, depending on the account you follow, either the group was ready and waiting on the road, and a different carriage passed through, carrying a senator, and the group decided to abort the mission when they realized it wasn't the president, or John Wilkes Booth went to the Campbell Hospital to see if President Lincoln was actually there and that their plans would be on track, and then he found out that he wasn't there. And then he went back and told the group, and everybody disbanded. So it could have gone either way. I've seen reports of both. Either way, though, the kidnapping plot failed, and the group of conspirators basically disintegrated.
Where are the others?
Gone, the craven cowards.
What do you mean, gone?
Backed out, quit. Atzerodt ran for home in Port Tobacco. I just left Arnold and O'Loughlin in the street. They've headed back to Baltimore. I should have shot them both.
I hardly see what good that would have done.
John, would you and Mr. Booth have a brandy?
Ah, madam, I would be most grateful for it.
Thank you, Mother.
Everyone went their separate ways, and John Wilkes Booth began drinking heavily in any bar that he could find. Well, actually, on March 18th, the very next day after the failed kidnapping, John Wilkes Booth would make his final appearance on stage in a performance of The Apostate at Ford's Theater. It's likely that the money that he got from this last play was meant to fund his heavy drinking from March 18th to the morning of April 14th. Michael O'Loughlin and Samuel Arnold left to go back home to Baltimore after the kidnapping failed, and they would never see John Wilkes Booth again. John Surratt immediately left the States and went to Canada to lie low for a while after the kidnapping failed. Dave Harold stuck around in D.C., and so did Lewis Powell and George Atzerodt. Harold and Atzerodt were both from the D.C. area, and Powell had simply not left for home yet. These three would all hang out with John Wilkes Booth periodically in between the failed kidnapping and the fateful day of April 14th. But there was no serious talk of taking action, not after the group had been disbanded. They spent much of their time at the Surrattsville Tavern, where Mary Surratt would discuss all kinds of shit with them. She really was the nest that hatched the rotten egg, which is why she ended up being hung along with everybody else. After the failed kidnapping, John Wilkes and the others kept going to the Surrattsville Tavern, and they all spent most of their time drinking. And before John Wilkes could organize a second attempt at kidnapping, the South surrendered at Appomattox. If the war had gone on for another year, John Wilkes might have taken another crack at the kidnapping, but somehow I seriously doubt it. Once the war was over, his mind switched over from how can we save the Confederacy over to how can I punish the architect of the Confederacy's destruction. And those are very different things.
If he was mad, if he went mad, his mind lost its balance after the fall of Richmond.
John Wilkes had always fantasized about killing President Lincoln, but he could never openly say so to the other conspirators. It was only after the war was over that he stumbled into a chance at pulling off the murder. When John Wilkes did mention his desire to kill President Lincoln in front of the whole conspiracy group, they immediately shot John Wilkes down and told him he was going way too far. The whole exchange ended with John Wilkes apologizing and saying that he had drank too much champagne, basically backtracking and acting like he didn't mean what he said. I'm pretty sure the whole group was on board with the kidnapping, but they wanted nothing at all to do with the murder. Perhaps Lewis Powell felt differently, since he actually followed through later on, but the rest of the conspirators seemed to all have been against the idea of killing President Lincoln. But that doesn't mean that they're not guilty, however. When none of the conspirators turned John Wilkes in, they sealed their fate in the eyes of the law, and that's why their necks ended up getting stretched in the end, except for a few of them. But let's move on. Here we are at last, the fateful day of April 14th, 1865. The day President Lincoln was murdered, and the day that the country was doomed to suffer under the disastrous, incompetent, deliberately obstructive leadership of Andrew Dickhead Johnson. But that's besides the point for the purposes of this video. The day begins quietly. Many of DC's inhabitants are still hungover from all the partying that has been going on ever since the Confederacy surrendered at Appomattox. From April 9th to April 13th, America was partying really hard, by the standards of their time anyway. People back then simply did not know how to rage like we do today, but they sure did try. I mean, they just didn't have EDM and party drugs like we do these days, so they can only get so far. Still, half the country was jumping for joy and partying like there's no tomorrow. The other half, along with John Wilkes Booth, was all upset and butthurt over losing the Civil War that they so eagerly started. Washington, D.C., on April 14th, before the assassination, was tranquil and peaceful for the most part. There were no protests, no riots, no disasters. The country was still in what could be described as a trance. It was from winning the war, and it had yet to be broken by the tragedy that would come later on that night. The people of America, on both sides, were extremely exhausted from the bloody and costly Civil War that had taken so much from the people of America. Everyone was ready to let loose and have a good time after the surrender at Appomattox. Even though the Southerners were left with an awful taste in their mouth because of it, they too wanted to have a good time. April 14th, 1865, was Good Friday. the Christian holiday. And in a country that was up to its eyes in religious mumbo-jumbo, that actually meant something. Good Friday is a Christian holiday, if you didn't already know. It's not as big of a deal as Easter or Christmas, at least nowadays, but Good Friday was still very important to many people living in the 19th century, especially in America. So there would have been a whole bunch of people going to church at one point or another on this fateful day.
I was delighted to hear the president was coming. Holy Week is a slow week in the theater, and audiences are especially thin at Good Friday performances. We had a house of 1,700 seats, and with the announcement in the afternoon paper that the president is coming, we could sell them all out, even at 75-cent top.
People back then, including Lincoln, were perpetually superstitious. So perhaps you were not aware that Friday, as a day in general, was thought of as bad luck. You were not supposed to make an appointment that you cared about on a Friday, not unless you wanted something to go wrong. So the Friday of April 14th, 1865, was pretty quiet overall. Not much was planned for that day in Washington, D.C., and most people would have been working or running errands the morning of the 14th. John Wilkes Booth included, and many more would have been at a bar drinking or getting over a hangover from the night before. That week was a rowdy one, like I mentioned earlier. So now that the stage is set, let's talk about John Wilkes Booth. Around 10 a.m., John Wilkes Booth was sitting on the stoop of Ford's Theater going through his mail. And that was when John Wilkes overheard Harry Ford, or perhaps a different theater worker, announced that the president was going to be attending the show Our American Cousin later on that evening at Ford's Theater.
Booth went to the theater that morning to pick up his mail. And I guess I looked happy because he asked me why I was so happy. I told him the president and General Grant were coming to the show that night. And, well, he sort of went pale.
John Wilkes became very excited when he heard this. He immediately sprang into action and began making preparations.
John Wilkes Booth is like, oh, what? Abraham Lincoln's gonna be at the theater tonight? Oh my God. I'm gonna change my plan from kidnapping him to assassinating.
He went to the Herndon House Hotel to let his conspirators know what was happening. Lewis Powell and George Azerodt, as well as Dave Harold, to be exact. The rest of the conspiracy had already gone, and Dave Harold would be coordinating with Booth very closely throughout this whole thing. After that, John Wilkes went to the Kirkwood House, where Andrew Johnson was staying. And there, John Wilkes left a mysterious note for the vice president. It was a calling card that said, "I don't mean to disturb you. Are you at home?"
Booth's friend, Mr. Atzerott, was registered here, but I'm certain that Wilkes Booth asked to see the vice president. He came in here and asked me, I remember it very well, if the vice president, Mr. Johnson, was in. Well, I told him no. Then he made out a calling card. He wrote, don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home? And he signed it J. Wilkes Booth. Now, I put that card right here in the vice president's mail. Booth wouldn't have been so formal with his friends now, would he?
Many conspiracy theorists like to claim that the existence of that calling card is evidence of Andrew Johnson and John Wilkes working together, but there is very little evidence to support that, and the impeachment trials that took place later on pretty much disproved that theory, but, that's besides the point. After the Kirkwood House, John Wilkes went to the Surratt boarding house so he could coordinate with Mary Surratt to have John Lloyd, the barkeep at Mary Surratt's other tavern, to get the guns ready for pickup later on that night. Louis Weichman would overhear this exchange, and he would later turn Mary Surratt in to the military investigators for it, even though Louis Weichman was supposed to be Mary Surratt's best character witness. In her mind, anyway. Louis Weichman had other ideas, though it's still up for debate on whether or not Mary Surratt actually knew what was going to happen. She might have, or she might not have. Either way, Louis Weichman made sure that she was in big old trouble with the law.
He had a package from my mother. She didn't know what was in it.
and he asked her to take the package with her to Surrattsville, that's the town named after my father, where she was going anyway to see Mr. Lloyd. We had an old tavern there. It has been said that she went to inform the tavern keeper to get things ready for Booth that night, guns and whiskey, but it's not true. She went to see about some money owed her. Booth used her.
John Wilkes went to the Surratt house 3 separate times that day, and it was the last visit that Mary Surratt incriminated herself by confirming that she had delivered the message to John Lloyd about the guns. After that, John Wilkes went to a stable that he knew well, where a friend of his worked. And while he was there, he rented the horse that he would use to escape Washington, D.C. After that, John Wilkes handed John Matthews a letter that supposedly outlined his entire plan and incriminated the other members of the conspiracy. But John Matthews would later burn the letter that John Wilkes gave him. He did so out of fear for the raging mob that was terrorizing the country after Lincoln's murder. So it's hard to blame the guy for getting rid of the evidence. But the fact is, the details of that letter are lost to the fire. John Matthews and John Matthews alone knows what was in that letter. And even he was not able to remember what it fully said. When he did try to recount what the contents of the letter said, he basically just plagiarized the contents of another letter that John Sleeper Clark showed to the newspapers in order to try to clear the Booth family name after everything had already happened. And that plan of John Sleeper Clark's ended up failing. Now, I know that's a lot of stuff to take in all at once if you don't already know about this stuff, but we'll come back to the John Sleeper Clark letters in a little while. Basically, John Wilkes Booth was a man on a mission the entire day of April 14th, and he did a whole bunch of stuff to prepare himself for the assassination. John Wilkes probably met with Lewis Powell more than once to make sure that Lewis knew his part in the plan and that he was still up to the task. Lewis Powell was the only member of the conspiracy that John Wilkes never bullied around. But then he never really needed to either. Powell was always on board with whatever John Wilkes wanted to do. John Wilkes also met with George Azerodt and basically bullied the man into going along with Booth's plan. John Wilkes told George that he was already implicated and that he might as well go along with it. But I don't think that George really believed him. So in the end, Azerodt tried to lay low and act like nothing ever happened. But it didn't take long for the law to catch up with him in the end. Honestly, involving George Giant Pussy Azerodt in the first place was a huge mistake. The man was unreliable and weak right from the start. And sending George Azerodt after Andrew Johnson was almost as big of a crime as going after Lincoln in the first place, in my opinion anyway. If John Wilkes had sent Lewis Powell after Andrew Johnson, I dare say that John Wilkes would have had a much better reputation in the annals of history, because Andrew Johnson had always been loathed by everyone in politics back then, and his presidency would be an unmitigated disaster from start to finish. Andrew Johnson vetoed every pro-black legislation that came through Congress, just because the motherfucker could. He also set the precedent that the vice president actually becomes the next president. That was never the rule before Andrew Johnson, but that's a whole nother story for a whole nother video. The point is, Lewis Powell would go after Secretary of State William Seward, and George Azerodt would get piss drunk and wander through the streets of D.C. while the whole city was in panic mode. And John Wilkes also met with Dave Harold to coordinate where they would meet after everything was all said and done, which was supposed to be just outside of the city past the Navy Yard Bridge, where they would both later cross to get out of D.C. While John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln, Dave Harold would assist Lewis Powell in gaining entrance into the Seward household. So from about 10 a.m. to to around 6 p.m., John Wilkes was making preparations and steeling himself for the grim task that he was about to undertake. This was mostly done in the form of liquid courage. John Wilkes spent at least a couple of hours in a local bar getting nice and buzzed before he even came to Ford's. And he was going back and forth to the saloon barely 20 minutes before he made his move, because John Wilkes could go in and out of the theater without being questioned. He also bragged and boasted the whole time that he was in the bar earlier that night. He claimed publicly that he was going to be doing the greatest performance of all time that very same night, and that the whole world would remember his name. This, of course, raised a few eyebrows from bystanders, but no one was going to make a big deal out of what seemed like idle boasting from an overly proud, failed actor.
A very strange thing, but Parker, the president's guard, he should have been upstairs guarding the president. He was sitting there not 10 feet from Booth. Parker, the president's coachman, the footman, they all were in here drinking. A stranger, drunk, toasted Booth. People always were doing that. They always recognized him. He said Wilkes Booth would never be the actor his father was. Booth just smiled. Said he was going to be the most famous man in America.
When John Wilkes was asked any specific details about where and when this supposed greatest performance of all time might be, he brushed all of the questions off and continued with his bloviating. So I doubt anyone listening to John Wilkes the evening of April 14th gave much of a shit about what he had to say. The patrons of a dive bar, or really any bar in the 1860s, were pretty much trained to ignore all kinds of shit-talking, even when it gets pretty dark. And in dive bars all over the place in the modern day, that rule still holds true. If you know, you know, right? Ford's Theater is packed to the rafters that night, even though it's Good Friday. Most of the time, going to the theater on Good Friday would have been seen as a breach of protocol from polite society. But the devastating war had just come to an end the week before, and many people were in the mood for some laughs. They had done enough praying up until then. So President Lincoln and many others felt like they wanted to go see some theater on that particular Good Friday evening. There should have been nothing wrong with that decision whatsoever, but that's not how the cookie crumbled, is it? By the time the show was in progress, around 9 p.m., President Lincoln had changed his mind about wanting to go to the theater, and he kind of wished that he didn't have to go, mostly because he was having a good time hanging with the boys at the White House. He was having drinks and cigars with his friends and his subordinates. But the newspapers had announced his plans to be at Ford's Theater earlier that day, so Lincoln felt like he had to be there, so as to not disappoint the people. Or at least, that's what other people said after the fact. Some people think that his wife, Mary Todd, dragged him to the theater, like he was a submissive husband who did what his wife dictated, no matter how unhappy it made him. But I'm not too keen on that theory, though I don't doubt that it was certainly possible. Mary Todd could be quite the pain in the ass, I have no doubt. Regardless of why President Lincoln went to the theater, all that really matters is that he did. Mary Todd and President Lincoln got into their carriage and began their journey into downtown Washington, D.C., where Ford's Theater was. And upon their arrival, Ford's Theater had really rolled out the red carpet and put on the show. General Grant was supposed to accompany President Lincoln to Ford's Theater the night of April 14th, but General Grant backed out at some point throughout the day. The reason for this was because General Grant's wife, Julia Grant, did not get along with Mary Todd Lincoln at all. Many people didn't, actually.
Mrs. Lincoln had a famous temper. She had several known incidents of public blow-ups. Julia, that's General Grant's wife, she couldn't abide Mrs. Lincoln, and Mrs. Lincoln once accused her of coveting her position in the White House. Well, Mrs. Grant just refused to go to the theater with her. Instead, she insisted on going immediately to see her daughter in a school in New Jersey.
Mary Todd was an eccentric and sometimes spiteful person. She would make public displays of power in front of other people, much like the scene in the movie Lincoln, where Mary Todd makes Thaddeus, Tommy Lee Jones, Stevens sit there waiting in line to greet the president and first lady at the White House, causing an awkward scene and holding everybody up.
How the people love my husband. They flock to see him by their thousands on public days. They will never love you the way they love him. How difficult it must be for you to know that. And yet how important to remember it.
Now, I don't know if that happened exactly the way they depicted it in the movie, but that kind of power play is what I'm talking about. Little digs here and there, little personal insults to people that she felt were jealous of her husband or whatever. Mary Todd could be unpleasant and spiteful, is my point. She was far from perfect and probably had more detractors than she had supporters.
His wife was clearly not a source of much comfort, in fact, an embarrassment. Mary Lincoln in the White House committed a number of fraudulent acts. She engaged in expense account padding. She engaged in payroll padding. She engaged in accepting bribes, in selling cotton trading permits. It's a outrageous story.
She might have been the first lady who was a potential liability because she was eviscerated by the press, because she was Southern, because she had half-brothers who were fighting for the Confederacy. She was lavish and intended to entertain lavishly, and for a while did not understand that it would look bad to do business as usual in a royal court atmosphere when people were dying.
Like, Mary Todd was not the most popular person in America at that time. She came from a well-established and well-respected family, which afforded her a lot of leeway, but her personality did not bring her very far, I'll tell you that. Julia Grant, in particular, did not like Mary Todd at all, and she did not want to be around her if she could help it. So General Grant and his wife traveled up north to see their children, whom they had not seen for a very long time. I don't blame the Grants for going to see their kids, honestly. I might have done the same if I were in their shoes. President Lincoln and his wife made something like 12 more invitations to other officials and military personnel to go to the theater with them, but everyone they invited turned them down for one reason or another, until finally Clara Harris and her fiancé/stepbrother Henry Rathbone were invited to go along with the president and Mary Todd. The president's carriage went to pick up Clara Harris and Henry Rathbone, and then went to the theater around 9:30ish or so. It was about halfway through the performance of Our American Cousin that the president and his party arrived. The exact timing of everything is a little hazy. When the president's party arrived to the theater, the show was stopped, and the opera started playing some special music for the president and his wife and their two guests. Everyone in the crowd stood up and started clapping, and then everyone took their seats after the president was seated. For a little while, the show proceeded as normal. Everyone was laughing and having a good time. Theater back then was quite rowdy, and sometimes the crowds would get quite excited, especially for a comedy like Our American Cousin.
Tell Miss Georgina about that American cousin of yours.
About my American cousin? Well, he's about 17 feet. And you better take care, Miss Georgina, or he'll take his tomahawk and scalping knife and scalp you immediately.
I watched a big chunk of the play for the research of this video, and it was actually quite funny, although the version that I watched was done by community theater actors, so I'm sure that the version that Lincoln saw was much better. Not to say that the one I saw was bad. It was good. Harry Hawk and Laura Keene were both stars of the play that evening. Laura Keene had been the one to organize the whole play and set everything up. I mean, this was her big night, and it was about to be ruined by a cowardly assassin before the play had even finished. But don't worry, Laura Keene did not lose very much by this whole tragedy. Her name went down in history forever, along with John Wilkes Booth and everybody else. Her name is almost always mentioned when anyone talks about this story. So, don't think that Laura Keene had her whole day ruined and was, somehow screwed over by this. After the assassination, Laura Keene traveled around with her bloody dress that she held the president's head on and used that as like a sideshow to bring people in. And she made a whole bunch of money doing it. So don't feel bad for Laura Keene. Moving on, though. While everyone was having a good time watching the play, John Wilkes Booth was skulking around like a fucking snake, checking his entrances and his exits, making sure that he knew his way in and out of the theater. He would use a trap door under the stage to get across without being noticed. The whole time, he was probably whistling a tune, Dixie or something equally offensive like that, knowing John Wilkes. More than one person would see him wandering around, and they would later regret not saying anything. One policeman saw him and asked himself, "Oi, I wonder what he's up to." I'm sure lots of witnesses that night saw John Wilkes and later regretted not saying something or doing something about it. But because John Wilkes was a relatively large actor and had a long history at Ford's Theater, no one gave him much thought. John Wilkes spent quite a while walking around the lobby of Ford's Theater. He would walk back and forth to the Star Saloon, which was right next door to Ford's, so he could get some whiskey and some cigars. And then he would come sauntering into the lobby of Ford's Theater for the last time, smoking a cigar and whistling a tune to himself. He would walk up to Harry Ford, the cousin of the owner of Ford's Theater, who was in the box office counting tickets, and he would spend a few minutes joking around with him, making small talk and knowing John Wilkes Booth, probably making some kind of brag, or possibly even hinting about what he was about to do. Harry Ford was probably a little bit afraid of John Wilkes, and he definitely didn't think that John was capable of doing anything crazy. So he didn't really give him much thought, beyond thinking that he was acting weird or something like that. Certainly, John Wilkes never raised enough suspicion for anyone to say anything about what he was doing. John Wilkes was very well known at Ford's Theater. This was home turf for him. So basically, Abraham Lincoln walked into the lion's den expecting not to get his neck bit. Sometime around 10 p.m. at night, the play was coming to an end, and it was getting close to the comedic climax that would result in the loudest bout of laughter from the audience throughout the entire play, which would have been immediately after Harry Hawk delivered the now infamous line,
"You soft-dologizing old man-trap!"
So John Wilkes Booth knew that time was running short. He had to move quickly if he was going to make it in time. President Lincoln had a valet with him the night of the 14th. His name was Charles Forbes, and he was standing outside of the door of the presidential box at Ford's Theater, making sure that no one disturbed the president without being vetted first. Charles Forbes, just like many others who encountered John Wilkes that night, did not really think much of John when they first saw him. John Wilkes was dressed all nice and dapper, just like everyone else in the theater that night, and Charles Forbes was not considered a gentleman, or whatever the hell dandies of the 1860s called themselves. So in the mind of Charles Forbes, he wasn't supposed to question the elite of society. This is at a time when the class divide was much sharper than it is today. John Wilkes handed Charles Forbes a senator's calling card to gain entrance into the presidential box, and Charles Forbes would have had no legitimate reason to deny entrance unless he knew the name and face personally. There were no pictures on these calling cards. It was just a name and something that said, "I'm a U.S. Senator." Potentially, John Wilkes got this calling card from his girlfriend's father, John Parker Hale, from New Hampshire, an abolitionist senator, I might add. John Wilkes had been seeing Lucy Hale, John Parker Hale's daughter, for at least a couple of years. They both lived in the National Hotel in Washington, D.C., and they were known to be courting each other for something like 3 years. It's likely that John Wilkes Booth got this calling card from Lucy Hale's father. After Charles Forbes let John Wilkes into the antechamber of the presidential box, John should have been greeted by another guard, one with a weapon and the wherewithal to question John Wilkes, possibly pat him down or ask if he is armed. Maybe that might have given John Wilkes away or caused John to lose his nerve. Even if there was one armed guard there that night, that could have made all the difference. But for whatever stupid, wasteful, useless reason, John Frederick Parker was not at his post that night.
The Lincolns are met by John F. Parker, the only guard assigned tonight to protect the president. Parker has been given his mission despite a former police record showing 14 reprimands for drunkenness, willful violation of police regulations, and sleeping on duty.
He was part of Washington, D.C.'s Metropolitan Police, and he was charged with protecting the president the night of April 14th. But when John Wilkes Booth was admitted to the antechamber of the presidential box at Ford's Theater, John Frederick Parker was nowhere to be found. No one knows where he was for sure until about midnight on April 14th. And the fucking guy had a prostitute in tow when he finally did show up at the local precinct, hours after Lincoln died. The guy arrested a hooker so that he could have a valid excuse for not being at his post. I mean, that's my best guess. But no one knows for sure what the hell John Frederick Parker was up to or why the hell he even arrested a prostitute. Or there's so many questions with that part of the story. But anyway, since John Frederick Parker was not at his post, John Wilkes was able to freely access the presidential box undisturbed. No one checking on him, no one patting him down, or even looking in his direction. Oh, and by the way, there are entirely too many fucking Johns in this story. Like, holy shit. John Wilkes, John Frederick Parker, John Surratt, John Parker Hale, John Ellsler, John Brown, and probably even more Johns that I can't even think of right now. But that's, besides the point. Anyway, the presidential box has like 3 doors to go through before you can actually get to the president. So John Wilkes had complete privacy for a few minutes before he had to make his move. And while he was preparing himself to strike, he was able to get a moment of calm and quiet to collect his thoughts and wait for the proper time in the play to make his move. If there was a guard outside of the door, he would not have had that crucial moment. So who knows what would have happened if John Frederick Parker was there at his post like he was supposed to be. That man should have been on the scaffold with the rest of the conspirators, if you ask me. But, once John Wilkes was in the antechamber of the presidential box, he used a shunt or a bar to hold the door shut, making it so the door could only be opened from the inside. It's likely that John Wilkes had planted the bar or the shunt, whatever word you want to use, into the small antechamber sometime earlier that day. This peephole that he used to look through the door and spy on the president to see if he was there or who else was in the presidential box was either drilled by John Wilkes himself at the same time that he planted the bar for the door, or the peephole was already there for theater staff to check on patrons using the presidential box. Either explanation for the peephole is plausible, and I wouldn't be surprised either way. All that really matters is that John Wilkes used the peephole to look in on the president to make sure that there were no surprises or guards to worry about on the other side. Then, after the time was right and Harry Hawk delivered the famous line that everyone knows so well,
"You soft-dologizing old man trap!"
John Wilkes Booth, son of the even crazier Junius Brutus Booth Sr., burst his way through the door leading into the presidential box, lifted up his .44 caliber Derringer that he had owned for something like 5 years, pointed it directly behind the president's head, something like 4 to 6 inches away, and pulled the trigger. President Lincoln, 16th President of the United States, slumped forward in his seat. Mary Todd Lincoln screamed at the top of her lungs, and John Wilkes Booth pulled out his Bowie knife to go after Henry Rathbone, who was now up and out of his seat and moving towards Booth. The two men grapple and fight a little bit next to the dying president, but John Wilkes was taller, stronger, better looking, and has a bigger dick than Henry Rathbone, and also has a Bowie knife, which he uses to slash Henry's upper right arm, causing him to bleed all over the damn place. Henry falls to the ground, blood oozing out of his arm, and John Wilkes doesn't waste any time leaping over the balcony of the presidential box. Some say he vaulted over the banister. like in this photo here, breaking his leg on the stage 11 feet down below, and I think that is the most likely answer, honestly, but others might insist that he climbed over slowly and deliberately and broke his leg later falling off his horse. Some people try to say that he tried to jump over the balcony and Henry Rathbone interfered, or John's boot got caught on the banister, or it was his spur, or his foot got caught on the picture of George Washington that was sitting on the balcony. I mean, there's 10 different versions of every event for this story, so, pick which one you like the most and stick with it, I guess. But the one that I like the most is that he just leaped over the balcony and did it a little too fast and broke his leg on the stage down below. People also disagree about what John Wilkes said after he was down on the stage. Most historians agree that John put his arms above his head with blade in hand and screamed aloud, "Sick! Step back, Tyrannus!" But there may be those who believe that he screamed, "The South is avenged." Eyewitness accounts can sometimes be unreliable, and it's up for debate on what actually happened. All we can really do is go by consensus and by what makes the most sense. Sic Semper Tyrannis was a motto that was always near the forefront of John Wilkes' mind. It was, and still is, the Virginia state motto, and the phrase had been associated with Brutus and Julius Caesar for hundreds of years. Yes, hundreds, not thousands. The phrase Sic Semper Tyrannis was probably never spoken by Brutus himself. The only witness we have of that time, Plutarch, says that if he did say such a phrase, no one would have heard him say it because all of the senators who killed Caesar fled the scene as soon as the deed was done. That specific phrase, Sic Semper Tyrannis, was started by a writer in the 1780s. His name was either George Wythe or it was George Mason. One of two people, and accounts differ on who exactly it was. And those guys got the idea for the phrase from the Odyssey. So there is no true solid source for the phrase Sic Semper Tyrannis, and the only thing that really matters is that John Wilkes knew the words, and he used them the night he murdered Abraham Lincoln in cold blood. After yelling to the crowd, he turned around and stumbled his way off the stage. On his way through the backstage corridors, John Wilkes Booth was heard saying to himself, "I have done it," over and over again. At one point, he had to run through a tiny corridor that leads to the back door of Ford's Theater, and there was another person blocking the way. Someone that John Wilkes knew personally, and probably liked, at least a little bit. William Withers was his name, and John Wilkes Booth ran into Withers at full speed, knocking the portly man to the ground, where he would strongly resemble an Oompa Loompa getting tackled. John Wilkes would say the 19th century version of, "Holy shit, it's William Withers." And then he would continue sprinting out of the theater at full speed. Then the poor kid that had been roped into holding John Wilkes' horse, Peanut John, was knocked in the head with the butt of John Wilkes' knife, and he was kicked in the ass for holding Booth's horse. Even though Edmund Spangler forced the poor kid to stand out in the rain holding the horse. Like, this poor kid got roped into doing this crap, and when John Wilkes showed up, he basically kicked the shit out of this poor kid and took the horse from him, even though the kid wanted nothing to do with any of this in the first place. I forgot to mention earlier that Ned Spangler was the one that John Wilkes told to hold his horse. He paid him to do it too. John Wilkes and Ned Spangler were drinking together earlier in the day, before the performance started. They were drinking at the Star Saloon that was right next to Ford's Theater. And that's where John Wilkes Booth asked Edmund Spangler to help him with his horse. Spangler was needed for the set changes in the theater. So a few minutes into Ned holding John's horse, he called over Peanut John to do it for him, without being paid for it, mind you. And after John Wilkes brutally and unfairly assaulted Peanut John, he awkwardly climbed up onto his horse and dashed out of Baptist Alley and onto F Street and on his way out of D.C. Ford's Theater turned into a madhouse after that. As John Wilkes was murdering President Lincoln in cold blood, in front of a dithering, slow-to-react audience who let the assassin leave Ford's Theater unharmed, the other conspirators were busy with their own plans. Lewis Powell had decided to stay loyal to his misguided master, attempting to fulfill the plan that John Wilkes set him on. As a result, Powell would go on a murderous rampage throughout the Seward family household in Washington, D.C., and George Azerodt, the third conspirator in this assassination plot, would stay loyal only to himself. He would do his best to hide and act like nothing happened, hiding at his cousin's house until the military caught up with him. But both men would end up doing things that would get them hung in a few short weeks. Lewis Powell would nearly kill 5 people, seriously maiming a couple of his victims, but ultimately failing to kill his target. And George Azerodt would spend his last few days getting drunk, and he would fail to do the one thing that might have saved his neck, which would be to go to the police and warn them about what was about to happen. If George Azerodt had done that, maybe he might have survived the coming storm of justice. But the reality is, George Azerodt basically went and got drunk while he was supposed to be killing Vice President Andrew Dickhead Johnson, the one man who was actually better off dead than alive, at least as far as the rest of the world is concerned. If George Azerodt had taken Andrew Johnson out, the name George Azerodt would not be nearly as contemptible as it is now. Because the way I see things, not only did John Wilkes doom America to the reign of Andrew Dickhead Johnson, but so did George Azerodt, because his life was already forfeit by being associated with John Wilkes and the conspiracy, so he might as well have just gone through with his part of the plan and spared history from the god-awful, miserable, detestable presidency of Andrew Dickhead Johnson. But because he didn't do that, I think we should all, as a group, collectively take a big old shit on top of George Azerod's head, or rather on his name. As for Lewis Powell, he went to the Seward residence pretending to be a courier, carrying precious medicine that would aid in the recovery of Secretary of State William Seward, who was basically President Lincoln's right-hand man. Lewis Powell would gain entry into the house by asking to deliver the medicine himself, but that only got him so far. After being confronted by William Seward's servant and told that he could not proceed any further, Lewis Powell then simply pushed past the servant and began climbing the stairs. When Powell encountered Frederick Seward on the 3rd floor, William Seward's son, he pointed the pistol in Frederick's face and pulled the trigger. But all anyone heard was a soft click. The gun had misfired, and Frederick's life had been spared. And that must have been one heart-stopping moment for Frederick Seward. But it was then followed by a hard pistol whip right to the face. So Frederick did not have long to contemplate his good fortune. Frederick Seward's skull was fractured by the blow as well. Lewis Powell had done a lot of damage to him when he struck him with the butt of his pistol. After savaging the first Seward son, Lewis Powell then stabbed another member of the Seward family, Augustus Seward. And after that, Lewis Powell was then confronted by William Seward's bodyguard, Sergeant George Robinson, as well as a male nurse that was attending to William Seward. But Lewis Powell basically kicked the ass of every person in that house, with no exceptions. He beat the shit out of both men and smacked Fanny around something fierce. The Seward family basically got a generational ass-whooping. If I didn't already mention this, William Seward was in a brutal carriage accident about 10 days before this attack, and he was in the middle of some intense recovery when Lewis Powell came knocking. He had a big metal neck brace supporting his neck and his back due to his injuries. So when Lewis Powell came rushing into William Seward's bedroom with a blade in his hand, Lewis was unable to decisively kill William Seward.
Seward is still alive. Legally, you're not a murderer, if you don't...
It wasn't my fault I didn't kill him. Steel thing on his neck.
Lewis tried to cut Seward's throat, but William Seward himself was not willing to lie there and be garroted like a cattle in the slaughterhouse. Seward was trying to fight Lewis Powell off the entire time, and with the big metal brace attached to Seward's neck and to his bedside, Lewis Powell was not able to get a clear shot at William Seward's throat. But that's not to say that William Seward was not severely injured. He was actually fucked right up from this assault. William Seward's face would never look the same after this attack. After struggling and failing to kill William Seward, Lewis Powell eventually decided that he had done enough damage and that he had better get out of there. I'm sure Lewis figured that Seward would die of his wounds sooner or later, because there was a lot of blood all over Seward's bed and on his room. On his way out of there, Lewis moved as quickly as he could to get out of the house, but he stopped by one more unlucky bystander. One Emmerich Hansel, a State Department messenger. He encountered Lewis Powell on his way out of there. And unfortunately for Emmerich, he picked the worst time ever to visit the Seward residence. Lewis Powell came bounding out of the stairwell straight into Emmerich, where Lewis Powell then stabbed Emmerich as a result of their fight. I don't know exactly where Emmerich was stabbed, but it hardly matters. When you get stabbed, you're kind of out of the fight, no matter what happens, really. After Emmerich was incapacitated, Lewis Powell left the Seward residence and essentially disappeared into the chaos engulfing Washington, D.C. as a result of Lincoln's assassination. Lewis Powell basically walked the streets of Washington, D.C. with no rhyme or reason until he got tired and bored. So he decided to go to the only place that he knew in Washington, D.C., Mary Surratt's Tavern. And that would turn out to be a gigantic mistake, because it would get Mary Surratt and Lewis Powell both caught by the investigators looking into the presidential assassination. And as for George Giant Pussy Azeroth, after deciding not to kill Vice President Andrew Dickhead Johnson, he basically wandered the streets just like Lewis Powell did, eventually getting picked up by the police at his cousin's house 2 days later. He was yanked out of his bed while he was taking a nap on his cousin's couch, and he was hauled off to prison and had a mask put over his head just like everybody else. John Wilkes would run full speed to the Navy Yard Bridge leading south out of Washington, D.C. Silas Cobb, the sergeant in charge of the bridge that night, stopped John Wilkes Booth and asked him a few questions. John Wilkes answered as honestly as he could, without giving himself away. The best liars tell as much truth as possible, after all. Silas Cobb saw no real reason to stop John Wilkes from crossing, so he let him pass. Whatever questions Silas Cobb asked of John Wilkes, well, John must have given the right answers, because, Silas Cobb let him go. I don't think it was much more malicious than that. Many conspiracy theorists will put a whole lot of emphasis on how Silas Cobb let John Wilkes go. They'll say that John Wilkes gave Silas a password or some shit, but I don't buy a fucking word of that. That's just an excuse to make this into a conspiracy. I don't buy that one bit, but that's besides the point, though. The same story would be true for Dave Harold, who was also leaving the city around the same time. The only real difference was Dave Harold was being chased by the guy that he rented his horse from. The guards at the bridge knew that they had done wrong by letting the fugitives pass when the guy chasing Dave Harold had showed up and asked him if they had seen a couple of guys coming to pass. But I don't want to get too in-depth on what happened at the Navy Yard Bridge, because this video is already long enough and we've got a long way to go still. Point is, John Wilkes Booth and Dave Harold escaped across the Navy Yard Bridge. Silas Cobb let both fugitives pass the bridge unhindered, and he would later get in a whole world of trouble for it. But before we move on, there's one thing I should say about poor old Cobb here. People like to point the finger at Silas Cobb like he was some kind of bad guy for letting Booth and Harold pass over the bridge. But I will always maintain that Silas Cobb was just doing his job and was simply unlucky to encounter John Wilkes Booth. At the time, his standing orders were to not let anyone cross the bridge after 9 o'clock p.m. without having a pass or reasonable excuse. But those orders were not thought of as being ironclad. Guards all over the place would let people pass over the bridge all the time, so long as they seemed normal and were not obviously doing something wrong. And that was perfectly understood by the higher command of the military near Washington, D.C. So no one should have been surprised when Silas Cobb let John Wilkes Booth and Dave Harold pass over the Navy Yard Bridge. I bet that if the fugitives had went to a number of other bridges, the outcome might have been the same. Orders to close everything down tight did not come until after John Wilkes had already gotten out of Dodge. I have no doubt that Silas Cobb felt very stupid for letting John Wilkes slip through his fingers, and I'm sure that he took a ton of heat and pressure from everyone around him after the fact. Silas Cobb was never court-martialed, but there is no doubt that he was on the frying pan. It would not be for long, though, because Silas Cobb would be dead within 2 years of the assassination. assassination. He died by drowning in a boat accident, which was a much more common occurrence back then. If anyone in this story is guilty of dereliction of duty, it's John Frederick Parker, not Silas Cobb. I don't see nearly as many people talking about him as I do Silas Cobb. And yet, from my point of view, John Frederick Parker is much more guilty. But that is not the point that I should be focusing on right now. Dave Harold and John Wilkes got past Silas Cobb and met up at their pre-appointed meeting place at Soper Hill and struck south for Surrattsville, where they would meet John Lloyd, an ex-policeman who ran and operated Mary Surratt's first tavern for her. He was a property manager / barkeep who paid rent to Mary Surratt, and he was the guy who was supposed to deliver the supplies to John Wilkes, as per the arrangement that Mary Surratt and John Wilkes made earlier in the day on April 14th. The two fugitives rode hard to get to Surrattsville, and they arrived sometime around midnight, with John's broken leg making the ride an absolute torture for him the entire way. Dave Harold pounded on the door and called for John Lloyd to come deliver the supplies. A bunch of whiskey, guns, and ammunition, as well as spyglasses for navigation. Binoculars, basically. As well as some food rations and probably blankets or something. After the fugitives got their shit from John Lloyd, John Wilkes began to feel the itch, the burning desire to brag about what he had done only a few hours prior. So John Wilkes says to John Lloyd, "How'd you like some news?" And John Lloyd says, "Well, you can do as you please about that." And John Wilkes takes that as an open invitation to incriminate himself even further and give the police a good start on how to find him. John Wilkes simply could not refuse an opportunity to brag. He tells John Lloyd that he was the assassinator of the president. And John Lloyd would later claim to the police that he wanted to kill John Wilkes on the spot for saying that he killed the president. But pretty much no one believes that John Lloyd would have done jack shit to John Wilkes. John Lloyd was afraid of John Wilkes Booth, and it was obvious to everyone involved. Lloyd just wanted to save face for letting the president's assassin go unhindered. John Lloyd's testimony would later prove incredibly useful to the investigators trying to find John Wilkes and Dave Harold, but also to the trial lawyers who would sentence and punish the rest of the conspirators.
But you knew the hiding place of the carbines and ammunition that Booth and Harold called for at the inn, less than an hour after they escaped across the Navy Bridge.
John Lloyd told you that. He lied.
The question of whether that's a good or a bad thing is something I leave to you, dear viewer. But there is no doubt that John Lloyd was talking shit when he said that he wanted to kill John Wilkes on the spot.
And Lloyd said, "Well, do as you please about that." And he said, "I'm pretty sure we've killed the president and Secretary Seward."
Lloyd later told detectives he thought of killing Booth and Harold on the spot.
You know, that story didn't really hold up. He's standing there with that other carbine in his hand, and he was terrified, I'm sure, of Booth, but more to the point, he was so staggering drunk, I don't think he really knew what to do or whether to believe what the man had just said.
After John Wilkes Booth and Dave Harold left the Surrattsville Tavern with their fresh supplies, they rode south as fast as they were able to, with John Wilkes' leg being in the condition that it was in. Their destination was the house of a former associate of John Wilkes Booth, Dr. Samuel Mudd, whom John Wilkes had dealings with after he returned from the Pennsylvania oil fields as a venture capitalist failure. If anyone says that Samuel Mudd did not know who John Wilkes Booth was, I say you are either deliberately lying because you have some kind of vested interest in the answer being different than what it is, or you have bought into the hypotheses of one crackpot over the consensus of the wider historical community. If any theory you have about anything involves the name of Nate Orloek, then I want nothing to do with it, and whatever idea you have is wrong. Nate Orloek is a crackpot, and that's that. But the more important point at hand is this. Samuel Mudd knew who John Wilkes Booth was before the two fugitives showed up at Mudd's house at 4 a.m. on April 15th, 1865. And there is no way anyone is going to convince me that Samuel Mudd did not recognize John Wilkes Booth as soon as he saw him. I'll bet you anything that John Wilkes Booth identified himself by name and reminded Samuel Mudd of where they met, even if Mudd had forgotten. The fact that old Samuel here lied about knowing John Wilkes and lied about a bunch of other details that we'll discuss later, I think it's fair to say that Samuel Mudd was an accessory to John Wilkes Booth. But I'm getting ahead of myself, as usual, though. Let's start at the beginning. John Wilkes and Dave Harold arrives at Samuel Mudd's farm that was previously operated and ran by slave labor, I might add, and Dave Harold bangs on the door until Samuel Mudd answers, and the men begin to talk. Samuel Mudd would have had the world believe that John Wilkes and Dave Harold told a grand story of deception to try to trick the poor old doctor into treating John Wilkes Booth, but I'll bet just about anything that the truth is as I said before. Samuel Mudd willingly took in his wounded former associate and treated him as best as Samuel Mudd was capable of doing. It's possible that Samuel was ignorant of what John Wilkes Booth had done, but it's also possible that John Wilkes had told Samuel Mudd outright, the same way that John Wilkes had told John Lloyd about what he had done. John Wilkes loves to brag, remember? And he would never pass up an opportunity to spread the idea of his own perceived glory. So who knows what these men talked about while Samuel Mudd was treating John Wilkes' broken leg. In most other doctors' offices at that time, if John Wilkes had walked in with his leg being in the condition that it was in, the doctors of the time would have all probably amputated the leg. But Mudd here did not want to undertake such a messy and difficult surgery. Plus, John Wilkes had to get the fuck up out of there as soon as possible. So Samuel Mudd would simply brace John Wilkes' leg and wrap it up real tight so the assassin could travel without too much pain. Dave Harold and John Wilkes would spend the night at Samuel Mudd's, getting some much-needed shut-eye and enjoying a few nice meals. The next day, Samuel Mudd goes into town to run some errands and gather some groceries. And the whole time, he's acting like he doesn't have the two most wanted men in America sitting at his house, hanging out with his wife and kids, eating his food, sleeping on his couch, shitting in his toilet. This lackadaisical attitude lasted only for a little while, however. Once Samuel Mudd saw the soldiers and the police mobilizing and fanning out to search for John Wilkes Booth, I think that's when he realized that he might have fucked up quite a bit. Instead of going to the police right away and letting them know that the man they wanted was back at his house, Samuel Mudd runs back home as fast as he can, after getting the supplies he needed, of course. Some of which were going to John Wilkes, I'm pretty sure. After he gets home, the two fugitives have already left, but they have not gone far just yet. Samuel Mudd catches up to them and berates the fugitives for involving him in such a big mess. John Wilkes apologizes, like that means much of anything, and begs Samuel Mudd to keep the secret of where he was going. Samuel Mudd had told the fugitives of where they could find some help from one Samuel Cox, who was a distant neighbor of Samuel Mudd. So John Wilkes wanted to make sure that Mudd was going to keep their secret. The doctor promised that he was not going to tell anyone where John Wilkes and Dave Harold went, but that promise would land Samuel Mudd in a whole heap of trouble when the law catches up to him the next day. As for the fugitives, they rode off lazily to the next stop on their journey, satisfied with a good meal provided by Samuel Mudd's wife, and the warm bed that John Wilkes was able to sleep in, as well as the shaving razor that John Wilkes was able to use to shave off his distinctive mustache. That would go a long way in helping John Wilkes hide his identity. I mean, shaving facial hair does more than you think for altering one's appearance. But let's not get distracted by the details, shall we? Basically, John Wilkes and Dave Harold left the Mudd farm feeling pretty much happy and content with themselves as much as they could in the circumstance they were in, which is ironic considering how much trouble they were in. After leaving Samuel Mudd's house, the fugitives traveled south a little ways and went to the house that Samuel Mudd recommended that they go, the house of a Confederate supporter known as Colonel Samuel Cox, who lived on a property known as Rich Hill. Dave Harold had a tough time finding Rich Hill at first, because they had left Samuel Mudd's house in the evening, and it was getting close to dark as they tried to find Rich Hill. Dave Harold and John Wilkes could not find the place, no matter how hard they tried. So they had to enlist the help of a local named Oswell Swan to bring them directly to Rich Hill. The party arrived at Rich Hill sometime in the early morning of April 16th, sometime after midnight, but before the sun came up. They knocked on the door of Rich Hill for a long time before anyone opened the door. But eventually, Colonel Samuel Cox answered. Old Samuel Cox himself would have the world believe that he only allowed the fugitives to stay for 15 minutes. But I don't buy that for a goddamn second, for a whole myriad of reasons. John Wilkes Booth put on all of the sweet-talking moves that he knew how to employ, and he tried his best to seem like a Southern patriot in need of patriotic assistance. But Samuel Cox felt like something wasn't quite right. So he refused to let the assassin and his accomplice stay inside the house on Rich Hill overnight. But Samuel Cox was willing to put on a nice full breakfast for everyone, though. After John Wilkes and Dave Harold ate another well-prepared meal at someone else's expense, they explained their situation and thoroughly begged Samuel Cox to hide them or assist them in some way. Samuel Cox decided that he would send his adopted son, Samuel Cox Jr., to go and find Thomas Austin Jones, a sympathetic local that would prove invaluable to John Wilkes Booth and Dave Harold in the week to come. Thomas Jones knew the surrounding forests and swamps like he knew the top side of his dirty old dick. So Thomas knew exactly where he was going to take the fugitives in order to hide them. Eventually, they arrived at a spot where they would hide for the next 5 days. A little camping spot that was well out of the way of any path that any soldiers might have been taking while they were looking for them. They were not allowed to build any fires for fear of being caught, so the whole experience was a miserable, damp, muddy, and cold-ass experience from start to finish, pretty much. John Wilkes and Dave Harold spent 5 whole days in the Zakiah Swamp. And the whole time, John Wilkes Booth was miserable and anxious like he had never been before. John Wilkes had never seen combat, and he had never done anything remotely stressful by the standards of the time he lived in. Theater work could be hard and miserable sometimes, but it's much easier than shivering all day every day, with the whole country doing its best to find you and kill you as soon as they can. Nothing other than the vicious warfare of the Civil War could have prepared John Wilkes for what he was enduring in the Zakiah Swamp. And yet, John Wilkes was too much of a coward to put himself through the crucible and really test the limits of his resolve. But then again, if John Wilkes had joined the Confederate Army, he almost certainly would not have ended up killing the president. He would have been humbled by the cruelty of war, like so many other men, or he would have been killed. And I doubt that John Wilkes would have had the burning desire to kill Lincoln if he had gone through 3 whole years of fighting. The only reason John Wilkes worked himself up to killing Lincoln is because he was pushed by the taunts of society around him. People teasing him for not joining the Confederates and helping the cause that he so viciously championed.
Also, the people, like his brother Edwin, were taunting him, saying, gee, you didn't do a thing, and your beloved South just went right up the spout.
If that had not happened, or if John had joined the Confederate Army, there's no way that John Wilkes would have been radicalized the same way. But that's a side point, and we should get back to the subject at hand. For like the 100th time throughout this video, Zakiah Swamp was boring as shit pretty much the entire time the 2 fugitives were there. The only time there was ever any excitement is when the Union nearly found them hiding in the woods. And probably one of the only reasons they escaped was because of what Dave Harold did to the horses. And what Dave Harold did to the horses will probably upset quite a few of you. He led the horses deep into the Zakiah Swamp, probably offering them treats and soothing the horses whenever they started to get nervous. And after they arrived to a deep sinkhole where Dave Harold was up to his waist in mud, he pulled out his rifle and coldly executed those 2 poor horses that never did anything wrong. Horses that John Wilkes and Dave Harold had rented from the local stables. I mean, honestly, if I was in the shoes of these 2 fugitives, I can't say that I would not have done the same thing out of self-preservation. But that doesn't change how fucked up it is to execute 2 innocent animals in cold blood like that. Especially horses, being as smart as they are. People are capable of some serious cruelty in times of great stress. After the horses were executed, Dave Harold sank their lifeless bodies deep in the Zacchaeus swamp, back to the mud that we all must return to one day. Dave Harold and John Wilkes Booth were nearly caught at least once during their 5-day vacation in the cold, wet woods of southern Maryland in the early spring. They spent the whole time in the woods, sitting around, doing a whole lot of nothing. John's leg was driving him crazy the entire time, and locomotion in general was a near impossible task without some serious effort, and he did not have any good modern crutches, something Dave Taylor highlighted during his recreation of John Wilkes' escape. Dave Taylor, a fantastic scholar of all things John Wilkes Booth, reenacted the whole journey that John Wilkes Booth undertook to escape, and he stayed pretty much the entire 5 days in the exact same spot. I suggest you check out his video series on it. The link's below. Thomas Jones would return each day around noon to bring supplies and, most importantly for John Wilkes, newspapers, as well as writing supplies. John Wilkes was eager to see the reaction of his life's greatest performance, and to his absolute horror, the whole world was unanimously against him for what he had done. The South and the North both were united in their condemnation of what John Wilkes Booth had done.
I don't think anything shook Booth as much in his entire life as the reviews he read of the assassination. They were profoundly unsettling to him. So unsettling, in fact, that if you read his diary carefully, you can see that he's not really sure he's done the right thing. He's shaken to the core here.
In fact, the whole country was sort of going through a fever-like purge the whole time our fugitives were hiding in the woods of the Zacchaeus swamp. There were probably 200 different cases of violence and lynchings across the country in the first week after Lincoln was murdered. Anyone who spoke out against Lincoln publicly was in some deep shit, depending on where in the country they were when they opened their mouths. Illinois was especially sensitive to this in the wake of Lincoln's death. Basically, no shit-talking of any kind was allowed if it was about Lincoln. The whole East Coast was basically seeing red. Many of the most politically minded people in the South after the Civil War knew full well that the South had lost her greatest ally in Washington when John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger. The South was sabotaged far more than the North was by Abraham Lincoln's death, and Southerners knew it. That's the primary reason I think John Wilkes Booth acted on his own, without the input of the Confederate government. But let's not get too distracted from the point at hand, as I keep saying at the end of every chapter. Basically, John Wilkes Booth spent 5 days in the swamp, bored out of his mind, spending most of his days writing in his journal and reading the newspapers that Thomas Jones brought to him. The writing that John Wilkes Booth did while he was in the swamp was as predictable as it was hard to read and fucking boring. Had been saying the same old shit that he had been saying for years. John Wilkes Booth had more self-pity in his writing than I think anybody else that I've ever seen. After 5 whole days in the Zacchaeus Swamp Forest, with the whole country flipping the fuck out trying to find John Wilkes Booth and Dave Harold, the two fugitives finally got a rowboat from Thomas Jones. They got all of their stuff, what little there was, and packed it all into the boat. The accounts of what was said between Thomas Jones and John Wilkes Booth is unreliable at best, because the only account there is of what was said between them is the account of Thomas Jones himself, and we can only rely on that so much. In 1893, Thomas Jones wrote a book about his account with John Wilkes Booth, and it was kind of a tell-all on what happened the day that he met John Wilkes Booth. And there are many historical inaccuracies within that account. I mean, that's what I've gathered from the reviews and the SparkNotes version of his book, because I just don't have time to read Thomas Jones's full account when he is only a small part of this larger story that we're doing. But from what I understand, the Thomas Jones account is not completely worthless, but it is filled with a whole bunch of lost cause rhetoric that is just verifiably false, since Thomas Jones himself was a Confederate who would have swallowed the lost cause myth hook, line, and sinker. So any account that he makes would have been tainted by their lost cause mythology. So you can only take so much from it, and, there's only so much value to it. Anyway, Thomas Jones claimed that John Wilkes Booth offered him a whole bunch of money for the cost of the boat that he gave to the fugitives, and as a reward for his valuable service. Now, John Wilkes Booth only had a little bit of money left by this point, probably less than $100, which would have been the equivalent to $1,828 today. Thomas Jones claimed that John Wilkes was willing to give him $50 or some shit like that, when there is no fucking way that John Wilkes would have offered that much money freely and without having to have been bartered for it. No way. If Thomas Jones was willing to let John Wilkes take the boat for free, I bet you John Wilkes would have done it. For some reason, Thomas Jones claimed that John Wilkes offered a bunch of money and that Thomas Jones just turned the money away. Oh no, I don't want your money. It's okay. You keep your money. Because Thomas Jones was a Confederate patriot and he didn't think that it was proper for him to take payment for helping John Wilkes. That's what Thomas Jones says in his personal account of what happened the night that he sent John Wilkes off to cross the Potomac. But I call bullshit on that right here and right now. Thomas Jones, in the end, would take payment for the cost of the boat, something like $17. And he claims that that's all he was willing to take, that John Wilkes Booth was trying to get him to take more, but Thomas Jones was just too good of a person to take more than what the boat was worth. Again, I don't buy that at all. I'll bet you that Thomas Jones had to barter and beg for the $17 that he did get out of John Wilkes. Because we all know how selfish and arrogant John Wilkes could be, especially in a desperate circumstance like the one he was in. The only time he was willing to pay anyone was when he felt like he was being slighted, like it was going to affect his pride for taking the help from somebody else, which you can see in his letter to Dr. Stewart in Virginia later on in the story, where John Wilkes wrote a letter to Dr. Stewart giving him some money for the dinner that he had because Dr. Stewart threw John Wilkes out of his house after that dinner was over. I'm going to mention that again in a little while, but I didn't plan on mentioning it right here because I had forgotten about it until I had gotten to the later part of the script. So don't mind me when I bring this Dr. Stewart letter up 3 different times in the next few chapters, but, you know, no big deal. So with all of that being said, I will let you, dear viewer, be the judge for what happened between Thomas Jones and John Wilkes Booth. Either Thomas Jones was a saint and would not take payment beyond the cost of the boat when John Wilkes Booth departed, or Thomas Jones had to dicker and fight with John Wilkes to get payment for the boat that he gave to them. It's up to you to decide which one makes more sense. To me, I just don't think that Thomas Jones is as high and mighty as he claimed to be, and I don't think that John Wilkes Booth is as generous as Thomas Jones claims he was. All that really matters for the purposes of this video is that John Wilkes Booth paid Thomas Jones for the boat he received, and the 2 fugitives used said boat to cross the mighty Potomac River. Dave Harold and John Wilkes Booth set out on their rowboat to cross the Potomac on April 21st, 1865. The mighty river was more than 2 miles wide at the point the fugitives planned to cross. Now, the Potomac River is not so large as the Mississippi, Amazon, or Nile, but that doesn't mean anything. Rivers are only small when they start, and as the rivers get closer to the ocean, they get bigger and meaner. The Potomac River has especially strong currents, too. It's no joke of a river, let me tell you what. Ships would sail through there all the time, and they had no trouble doing it. It was a big, deep, powerful river. So when these 2 completely inexperienced sailors got into their little dinghy of a rowboat, they were taking one major risk, which is fine considering the circumstances that they were in, but that don't make it any less dangerous. They could have just as easily drowned as they could have crossed the river. I mean, shit, the night after John Wilkes Booth first set out on the river, on April 22nd, 1865, there was a terrible boat accident on the Potomac River between 2 large ships carrying troops and people. The coal barge, called the Black Diamond, was commandeered for service in picket duty within the Potomac Flotilla. And the Potomac Flotilla was like a militia organization for ships. The Black Diamond was pulled into service within this organization. So it was a coal barge, but it wasn't really carrying any coal. It was carrying a few passengers who operated the ship and who were part of the Potomac Flotilla. And it was on duty the night of April 22nd, when John Wilkes Booth would have been leaving the Maryland shores for the second time. because John Wilkes and Dave Harold landed back in Maryland when they took off from the Potomac River the first time. They nearly ran into a Union gunboat when they tried to cross the first time, and they let the current take them, so they ended up back in the shores of Maryland. The second time that they took off, which was the night of April 22nd, going into the morning of April 23rd. And that was the same time that the Black Diamond was on picket duty, guard duty basically. And they were looking for John Wilkes Booth, too. That was the reason that the Black Diamond was out that night. So the Black Diamond had their anchor down, and they were part of a line of ships meant to block John Wilkes Booth from crossing. And around 1 a.m., another privately owned ship by the name of the Massachusetts saw only one lamp in the dark as they were traveling down the Potomac, headed from Alexandria to bring the soldiers on board back to their various regiments. It's not the USS Massachusetts, it's just the Massachusetts. They saw only one light and thought maybe it was a shore light or a fucking firefly. Who knows what they thought. But they didn't think much of the light as they sailed into it. They might as well not have even seen the light because they struck the Black Diamond directly where the boiler was, causing her to sink extremely quickly. The whole scene was a disaster. Over 80 people would end up dying in the collision. Most of those people were part of the crew for the Massachusetts, because many of the passengers of the Massachusetts were soldiers, and they did what they could to rescue as many as they could. But a lot of people would die in that rescue attempt. 87 in the end. I'm not sure how many were passengers of the Massachusetts and how many were passengers of the Black Diamond, but that's a lot of people to die in one night. And the Potomac was in low tide at that time as well. So the waters were not even that high. Something like 3.5 fathoms, which is like 21 feet deep. Most of the people that died were the passengers of the Massachusetts. There were something like 300 people on that boat, and something like 10 to 20 passengers of the crew combined on the Black Diamond. When the two ships struck, men started jumping over to the sinking ship to see if they could help, and they only ended up trapping themselves on what would soon be a death trap in the form of a sinking ship. The Black Diamond would not have been where it was if John Wilkes had not killed President Lincoln. So at least some portion of the blame for this tragedy should be laid at the feet of John Wilkes Booth. Not all, of course, but at least just a little bit. Because if John Wilkes had not killed the president, the Black Diamond would not have been there, and the Massachusetts would have never struck her as she was coming up the Potomac River. I mean, it's a pretty solid enough argument, I guess. It probably wouldn't make it through a courtroom, but, morally speaking, right? Now, I know I got a little bit distracted there, but hopefully you guys were able to decipher my incoherent babbling. The point of this whole section is this. I'll summarize it real quick. The first time John Wilkes and Dave Harold take off to cross the Potomac, they have their teary-eyed goodbye with Thomas Jones, and they get lost on the river when they nearly run into a gunboat. They let the current take them. They land on the Maryland side of the Potomac River, upstream from where they started. So they wait one more day in the woods at the spot that they landed, and they try again the next night. On that night, the Black Diamond and the Massachusetts crashed into each other, and 87 people died, not even a couple miles away from where the fugitives crossed. Then, after a silent and blood-chilling crossing of the Potomac River, the assassin, John Wilkes Booth, and his loyal butt boy, Dave Harold, landed on the Virginia side of the Potomac River. They stashed their boat somewhere that they thought no one would find it, and began moving inland towards what they hoped would be a nice, warm welcome from the recently dissolved Confederacy and its war-torn people. John Wilkes saw Virginia and the South in general as God's beloved country, his favorite place in the whole world. He thought that once he reached Virginia, he would basically be home free. But boy, oh boy, was he mistaken about that. Thomas Jones had told the fugitives where they could get some help after they crossed the Potomac. Jones told them that they should seek out a woman named Miss Quisenberry when they arrived on the Virginia side of the Potomac. The two landed about a mile south of where her house was, and Dave Harold walked off alone to see if she would help them. John Wilkes Booth would stay behind with the boat and wait for Dave Harold to return, because his leg hurt too much for him to walk. Dave Harold would get to Miss Quisenberry's house, only to find that the matriarch herself was not there. Only Miss Quisenberry's daughter was there at first. So Dave Harold would talk to the daughter and ask her for help, but there was not much that Miss Quisenberry's daughter could do to help Dave Harold and John Wilkes. After a while of Dave Harold asking the daughter to help him, the mother finally showed up after a little while. When Dave Harold told her the kind of help he needed, Miss Quisenberry did not want anything to do at all with the fugitives. At first, Dave Harold asked Miss Quisenberry for a place to stay and some food to eat, and he was not only refused, but he was viciously refused. Miss Quisenberry wanted nothing to do with the fugitives, and she made that perfectly clear. Then after being denied shelter, Dave Harold asks her if he could buy a horse off of her, and Miss Quisenberry shoots him down hard. After Dave Harold started to walk away in dejection, Miss Quisenberry had a change of heart and asked if they needed some dinner for the night, to which Dave Harold responded in the positive. She told Dave Harold that someone would bring them dinner later on and to act as their guide. Dave Harold thanked her and walked off to go back to John Wilkes Booth. The man that Miss Quisenberry would send to help was a man that John Wilkes Booth knew well, someone who even offered to help with the kidnapping plan in 1864. His name was Thomas Harbin, and he met John Wilkes Booth through their mutual friend, Dr. Samuel Mudd. So I'm sure John Wilkes Booth was happy to see a familiar face now that he was in Virginia. Thomas Harbin would lead the fugitives to the house of one Dr. Stewart, who wanted absolutely nothing at all to do with John Wilkes Booth and his loyal butt boy, Dave Harold. Dr. Stewart was nice enough to give the two fugitives some food, even though he wanted nothing to do with them, which was yet another meal at someone else's expense for these two fugitives. And after the meal was over, Dr. Stewart kicked their asses out. Dr. Stewart don't play no games, homeboy. You look sus to him, and you'll find your ass outside before you can even say the word Lincoln. I like Dr. Stewart. He's a fucking badass. John Wilkes was so mad about how he was kicked out of Dr. Stewart's house that he took the time to write more than one letter to the eternally badass Dr. Stewart, rebuking him for his lack of hospitality and offering to pay for the meal that was begrudgingly given to the fugitives. As weird as it sounds, being paid for a meal that you offered to a guest was seen as an insult. And I guess it still is today, depending on who you are. If you're some rich guy, then you'll probably have a huge stick up your ass about who pays for the meals. Tony Soprano makes a big deal about it. John Wilkes wrote the first draft of the letter, offering $5 whole as payment for the meal, which you can read on the screen now. But he never actually sent Dr. Stewart that letter. The real version that he actually sent only offered $2.50 in return for the meal. You see what I mean about John Wilkes Booth being a cheapskate? There's no way John Wilkes Booth was offering Thomas Jones more money than what the boat was worth. Remember when I was talking about that earlier? Yeah. There's no way this motherfucker was giving anybody any money unless it was going to benefit John Wilkes in some way. And John Wilkes giving money to Dr. Stewart really only benefited John Wilkes because it soothed his wounded pride. I'm sure Dr. Stewart was laughing his ass off the whole time John Wilkes was limping his way off his property. And I bet you Dr. Stewart couldn't give two shits about that $2.50 that John Wilkes gave to him. But you can believe that Dr. Stewart was living in John Wilkes' head rent-free for the rest of the time that John Wilkes was alive. The conceited, insufferable piece of shit that he was. Didn't I just promise not to get sidetracked earlier? Like, I'm pretty sure at some point in the script earlier on, I promised to stop getting so sidetracked, but, like, I just can't help it, guys. I'm sorry. Anyway, after being rudely thrown out of Dr. Stewart's house, John Wilkes and Dave Harold are still dead set on finding somewhere that they can stay for the night, refusing to stay another night out in the elements. Even though these guys are on the run, and they're wanted by the cops, and they need to be on the move and drawing as little attention to themselves as possible, these guys still feel the need to go pushing into people's houses and leaving witnesses for the police to talk to. So after a while of walking around searching in the dark, they come across the home of a freed black man named William Lucas. And true to the character that John Wilkes is, he forcefully and disgracefully threatened the Lucas family's lives with their knives and guns, and made the poor Lucases have to sleep out on their own goddamn porch while John Wilkes Booth and Dave Harold slept in the Lucases' beds. What a pair of assholes these two were, especially John Wilkes. That shit is inexcusable. There ain't no reason that John Wilkes and Dave Harold couldn't have just knocked on the door and slept on the fucking floor of the Lucas' house. But because they're both white supremacist pieces of shit, what the fuck do you expect? He fucking made them sleep outside, for Christ's sake. And the next day, John Wilkes forces William Lucas to have his son drive their carriage with them on it over to the shores of the Rappahannock River. Obviously because John Wilkes' leg is fucking killing him, and he doesn't want to walk if he doesn't have to. So he threatens these poor people and makes them fucking carry him around and act like their own personal taxi. When they arrive on the shores of the Rappahannock River, the fugitives try to employ the help of a fisherman named William Rollins to help them cross the Rappahannock. And William Rollins says that he's willing to help, but only after he was done with his fishing for the day. So as the fugitives are sitting around waiting for the fisherman to finish with his catch, a group of Confederate soldiers who were on their way home from the war show up to the spot that the fugitives were waiting. There was a tense moment where John Wilkes and Dave Harold were afraid that the soldiers approaching were Union soldiers hunting for the assassins, but it turned out to be that they were Confederates. The group was led by a man named Willie Jett, or at least Willie Jett is the one who did the talking. And he was barely 18 years old when all of this was happening. When the two fugitives met with Willie Jett and his two Confederate soldier traveling companions, they all hit it off rather nice. Willie Jett even asked John Wilkes Booth for an autograph, and the arrogant turd wrote a poem for Willie Jett instead. Though the poem was a bit more dour and cynical than what you might have expected it to be before John Wilkes Booth had read the newspapers that Thomas Jones had given him.
Willie is absolutely fascinated by this celebrity. You know, he's thinking, wow, you are the guy who killed Abraham Lincoln. He says, what was it like? And at this point, Booth just sort of hung his head and he said, well, it's nothing to brag about. And that spoke volumes. He had gone from thinking the world is going to love me for this, and all of a sudden it's like, let's talk about something else.
The country's attitude towards what John Wilkes Booth had done had soured John's disposition quite a bit. But anyway, Willie Jett and his buddies let the fugitives ride bitch on their horses, and they promised to take them to someone that they said would help. Little did John Wilkes know, the place that Willie Jett would take him would later turn out to be his grave. And Willie Jett would severely regret lending aid to John Wilkes Booth when the law catches up to him the next day. Willie Jett and his buddies would bring the fugitives to the farm belonging to a man named Richard Garrett, a crotchety and difficult old man who had fierce loyalties to the Confederacy. His belief in the cause was just as broken as the rest of Virginia's people. Their wartime spirit was broken, and most people, including Richard Garrett, did not want any more trouble than what the war had already brought upon most of the South, especially the 60-mile-wide swath of land that was devastated by Sherman's march to Atlanta. Richard Garrett was out of the way enough that he was not in the direct path of Sherman's fury, but he did have his share of troubles to contend with as a result of the Civil War. So when John Wilkes Booth, Dave Harold, Willie Jett, and his two friends show up to the Garrett farm, old man Richard Garrett is friendly but cautious. Richard's sons are even more cautious of the strangers, but they are too young to really say much right off the bat. The decision to let the fugitives stay was up to the old man. It was his house after all. The group started talking, and Willie Jett introduced John Wilkes as a fellow Confederate in need of a place to stay and some food to eat. John Wilkes tried his very best to be as charming as he could, but after 10 days on the run, even though he had slept in plenty of other people's beds throughout the journey, John Wilkes was visibly stressed and particularly gaunt-looking by the time he reached the Garrett farm. And the 10 7 days of miserable agony from his leg was certainly not helping John Wilkes's mood any more than you would expect it to. Richard Garrett, initially, was more than happy to have the two fugitives stay for the first night. The Garretts put on a nice warm meal for everyone to eat, and there was plenty of good conversation throughout. Everyone had a grand old time, and there were no problems really at all for the first whole night. Although, something was not quite feeling right with many of the answers that John Wilkes gave to the questions that the Garretts asked, and with the way that John Wilkes was acting, but they were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt for the first night that the fugitives stayed at the Garrett farm. Whenever things were peaceful at the Garrett farm, John Wilkes was mostly friendly and was happy to play with the younger children who lived at the Garrett farm. But during the first day of their stay, the sound of horses were heard coming up the road. I'm not sure exactly when this happened, but when it did, John Wilkes and Dave Harold bolted for one of the barns in the back of the property, hiding as best they can from the soldiers riding past. Soldiers that were directly looking for John Wilkes Booth. It might have even been the 16th New York Cavalry Detachment under Lieutenant Edward Doherty and Detectives Everton Conger and Luther Baker, but I can't find definitive proof that it was the same unit. There is no doubt, though, that the 16th New York Detachment did pass through the same area that John Wilkes was in. I just don't know for sure that they were the same exact unit that passed by the Garrett farm. When Richard Garrett and his sons saw how the fugitives behaved when the army passed by, they all grew suspicious towards the strangers.
Why are you running? The war is over. You said you fought for Virginia troops. What's going on here? And then it all starts to crumble. Everything starts to unravel.
The Garretts thought the fugitives might try to steal their horses. So one of the Garretts, specifically the oldest son of Richard Garrett, John Garrett, asked John Wilkes and Dave Harold to leave, and even offered to find them transportation if they would go. But the ever-arrogant and difficult John Wilkes Booth refused to leave. He told John Garrett that he would not leave right away, as he was a lazy freeloader and wanted to get caught or something. I don't know. So John Wilkes told John Garrett that they would leave the next day, to which John Garrett would acquiesce. The Garrett kids were in their 20s at the oldest, so it's not like they were going to put up too strong of a fight when John Wilkes Booth insisted that he would stay another night. But you can believe the Garretts would be on high alert after this altercation. And honestly, John Wilkes Booth should have wanted to get the fuck up out of the Garrett's farm, because he should have known that the law was coming. I don't know why John Wilkes was so hell-bent on staying in one spot, and always insisting on sleeping in someone's house. I guess John Wilkes was just a plain old stupid fugitive that wanted to get caught by the law or something, because you would think a fugitive in his position would have been moving as quickly and quietly as possible. Anyway, after John Wilkes and Dave Harold were spooked by the law riding by the Garrett's house and refused to leave when asked, after all that, the Garretts told the fugitives that they were not allowed to stay in the house any longer. If they were determined to stay with the Garretts, they would have to sleep in the tobacco barn in the back end of the property, instead of inside the nice warm farmhouse. And the dinner that they would have on that second night was nowhere near as pleasant and enjoyable as the first night was. Tensions were high, and suspicions were even higher. I'm sure John Wilkes Booth was furious with the Garrett's decision, the arrogant and selfish fool that he was. "How dare you kick me out of your own house, good sir? We have only just met, and you won't let me sleep in your bed and fuck your wife? The audacity you have! What a terrible host you are!" That's just the kind of person that John Wilkes Booth was. You give him an inch, and he takes a mile. And he would berate you the whole time for not wanting to give up that same mile. Anyway, John Wilkes Booth would stay for 2 days and 1 night at the Garrett house. On the second night is when the law showed up. There were likely a few visitors in the interim, however. Perhaps Willie Jett's friends, Ruggles and Bainbridge, might have come to warn John Wilkes that the law was close. But what I know for sure is that John Wilkes Booth spent the 2 days at the Garrett farm like he didn't have a care in the world, so long as he thought the law was not on their way. which of course they were the entire time. John Wilkes Booth didn't know it. And as I said before, the Garretts began to get real suspicious. And as everybody went to sleep that night, they thought the fugitives were going to try to steal their horses, since horses were an incredibly valuable resource and tool back then, and really still is. It makes sense why the Garretts were so defensive of their horses. And as a result of that paranoia, John Garrett, the oldest son of Richard Garrett, locked the tobacco barn that the fugitives were sleeping in on the second night of their stay, causing John Wilkes Booth to be trapped like a fish in a fishbowl when the Union cavalry showed up. But honestly though, I doubt John Wilkes Booth would have made it very far, even if the doors had been unlocked. The man's leg was all but destroyed at this point, and it really needed to be amputated, going by the medicine practices of that time. John Wilkes was slower than a herd of turtles stampeding through peanut butter. The man was not escaping jack shit, but being locked inside the Garrett tobacco barn certainly made this whole experience a whole hell of a lot more harrowing for the fugitives, and a lot more climactic for history. I mean, shit, many would argue that these guys deserved that harrowing experience. One little consolation prize that the fugitives had was that they did not have a very difficult day before they were caught. Their last day of freedom was actually a rather pleasant one, so at least they had that before they lost their lives. It's more than they deserved, I can tell you that. At least, it's more than John Wilkes deserved. Anyway, I wonder how many times I've said the word anyway throughout this video. I would really, if there was an easy way to count, I would do it. Anyway. Again, Dave Harold had the bright idea of going into town and looking for a doctor for John Wilkes' leg. And he talked John Wilkes into paying for the whole expedition as well. So Dave Harold went into the nearest town with some of John's money in his pocket and promised him that he was going to find a doctor and come back with help. My boy Dave Harold here took that money from John Wilkes Booth, went to the nearest town, and got some hookers to spend the afternoon with. Man had a three-way for less than a few dollars as an afternoon snack while he was on the run from the law. And somehow, modern lonely-ass men have a negative view of prostitution. I mean, shit, boys, you should be out there picketing with the sex workers. Get prostitution legalized so you can easily and accessibly go out and get some poom-poom. Dave Harold had no trouble at all getting some ass on short notice while being chased by the entire country. I mean, that's what I call sex positivity. Of course, Dave Harold getting his freak on would lead the cops directly back to the Garrett farm, since the prostitutes would report everything Dave Harold would say to them, and the police would get a hold of Willie Jett after they spoke to the fisherman from earlier on, the one who said that he would take the fugitives across the river. William Rollins. Yeah, he would tell them where Willie Jett was, and Willie Jett would lead the cavalry directly back to the Garrett farm with a gun pointed at the back of his head. So the whole web was pretty much unraveling as Dave Harold was getting his dick wet. The Union was not fucking around at this point, and anyone who got in the way of finding John Wilkes Booth would have been cruising for a bruising, really. After Dave Harold was done with his business, he basically just walked up out of there and went back to the Garrett farm and told John Wilkes that, oh shit, sorry man, couldn't find anybody. No doctors. I don't know what to do. Sorry. Money's gone. I got robbed or something. Sorry. I can only imagine the excuses that Dave Harold gave to John Wilkes. Because, what was John going to do at this point? It's the very end of the road. I mean, they might not realize that yet, but it's the end of the road. John Wilkes' leg is fucking destroyed. He can barely move, and he relies on Dave Harold heavily for pretty much everything. So when Dave Harold takes some of John's money and goes out and gets some ass with it, there really isn't much John Wilkes can do about it. And even if Dave Harold had told John Wilkes right to his face, hey, I went and got some ass with your money, there wouldn't have been nothing that John Wilkes would have done. What's he going to do? Kick his only helper out and tell him to leave? I mean, come on. I mean, John Wilkes was at Dave Harold's mercy, and I think John knew it. So who knows? Maybe John Wilkes gave Dave Harold that money on purpose to, hey, here, buddy, go get some poom-poom. Just for you. Who knows? I don't know. I doubt it, but you never know. Point is, Dave Harold got laid the night before he was arrested. That's the point. So, come midnight on April 25th, leading into the 26th, the Union cavalry came storming up the road leading up to the Garrett farm. The fugitives would hear the army coming, but they were locked inside of their tobacco barn and couldn't do anything but stay still and hope for the best. When the 16th New York Cavalry showed up to the Garrett house, they meant business for at least the first part of the showdown. Lieutenant Doherty, Conger, and Baker were not fucking around with their questioning of the Garretts. And they would threaten to hang the old man Richard Garrett for not being honest and forthcoming with the soldiers when they asked where the traitors were. Richard Garrett kept trying to dick around and beat around the bush. He kept acting like the fugitives had already left, or that they had never been there in the first place. But Lieutenant Doherty was not having any of it. Richard Garrett basically tried to cover for John Wilkes Booth for some reason, and he nearly had his neck stretched for it. Perhaps the old man was just incapable of speaking with Union boys. The Confederate blood ran too deep in old man Garrett or something. I don't know. Although I doubt Richard Garrett would have been actually hung, just for the record. I think they were just threatening the old man and trying to get him to talk. But before the hanging threat could escalate any further, Richard Garrett's oldest son, John Garrett, spoke up to rescue his father. And as soon as he did, a 6-shooter handgun appeared underneath the young Garrett's throat. Lieutenant Doherty had demanded to know where the assassins were, and he wanted to know right away. John Garrett would reluctantly tell them, He's in the barn, and that would elicit a gesture that the gun was going to go off pretty soon. Lieutenant Doherty angrily responds, "Not good enough. There's 3 barns. Which one is he in?" And John Garrett would point them to the tobacco barn at the rear of the property. The Union cavalry was close to their quarry, and they were well on their way to arrest John Wilkes Booth. Except they would do the exact opposite of that. As the soldiers approached the barn, they immediately saw movement from within. Dave Harold was doing a piss-poor job of staying still and keeping himself hidden, likely because Dave Harold saw the writing on the wall. So the soldiers began to surround the poorly constructed tobacco barn, setting up a defensive perimeter that no one would be able to escape. Least of all, a crippled assassin by the name of John Wilkes Booth. Unless, of course, your name is Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, Patrick Swayze, or Solid Snake, then you might have been able to get out of there. But John Wilkes Booth was going precisely nowhere in a hurry. After a little while of John Wilkes pretending like he wasn't really there, eventually he started talking with the soldiers. Now, many historians and tactically literate people who have explored this case have said that Lieutenant Doherty clearly failed in his role of leadership when he dithered and waited around for hours negotiating with John Wilkes. Any competent on-scene commander in any modern-day law enforcement would have seen the weak position that John Wilkes had, and they would have ordered an immediate breach and clear of the barn. Even with the gear and kit that the Union soldiers had back then, they would have had plenty enough to overwhelm and arrest John Wilkes Booth. And with the condition that John Wilkes Booth was in, I doubt that they would have taken many casualties in the attempt. And with the amount of people that were dying all over the country as a direct result of Lincoln's death, you would think that Lieutenant Doherty would have been willing to take a few losses in order to capture Booth alive. Boston Corbett had been asking to go in there right from the start. Good old Boston here wanted to do a solo mission and be the hero of the day. But Lieutenant Doherty had turned him down and told Boston Corbett to get back on guard duty and keep his mouth shut. And I don't blame Lieutenant Doherty one goddamn bit for telling Boston Corbett to shove his heroic dreams up his ass. But that doesn't mean that Lieutenant Doherty should have done nothing. Because then Lieutenant Doherty would spend the next 3 hours going back and forth with John Wilkes Booth, when they could have stormed the barn at any time and pulled John Wilkes out of there by his broken leg. Doherty's failure to execute his orders competently would not stop there either. Instead of sending a soldier to go and talk to John Wilkes Booth, or even perhaps going himself, Lieutenant Doherty grabs John Garrett, a civilian, and the one who had sold John Wilkes out in the first place. And Lieutenant Doherty tells John Garrett that he has to go into the barn and collect John Wilkes' weapons and accept his surrender, as if John Wilkes is going to fucking play along with that. I don't know what the hell Doherty was thinking by deputizing a civilian as a negotiator. The man was clearly out of his mind and in the mood for abdicating his command. So John Garrett would basically shit his pants all the way into the barn, where he would shakily inform the fugitives that they had no chance of escaping and that they had just better give up. And John Wilkes would come out of the darkness to talk to John Garrett, like an apparition appearing from the inky black inside the barn. But all he would say is, "You, sir, have implicated me."
Curse you, John Garrett! You have betrayed me!
"Get out of here before I shoot you." And John Garrett would not take any more convincing than that to get the fuck up out of there. And I don't blame him one bit. John Garrett should not have been there in the first place, goddammit. Lieutenant Doherty was fucking crazy for sending John Garrett in there. Like, what the fuck? He was just a kid. Anyway, after the totally inappropriate negotiation was over with, Lieutenant Doherty began talking with John Wilkes directly. He demanded that the traitors drop their weapons and come out with their hands up.
Doesn't make any difference who we are. We know who you are, so surrender your weapons and come out of there.
Of course, John Wilkes responded in the negative, and probably in some pretentious, insufferable way that only a Southern dandy of the 19th century would do. The whole time, Lieutenant Doherty is bleating his orders at John Wilkes Booth. Dave Harold is whispering in John's ear as well. Now, Dave Harold wants to surrender something fierce, and he wants to try to save his neck as best he can. So he doesn't want to go down with the ship. He's finally realized after all this time that John Wilkes Booth was a losing horse and that Dave was crazy for following him this long in the first place, but somehow John Wilkes is angry with Dave Harold for not wanting to die alongside him. Because again, John Wilkes has no empathy whatsoever. What do you mean you don't want to die with me? What? You're gonna leave? That's how John Wilkes saw Dave Harold at the very end. Like, he looked down on Dave Harold for wanting to save his own skin. I can't understand John Wilkes' thought process. This guy just really only ever thinks of himself. But of course, John Wilkes is not hardcore enough to actually do anything about Dave Harold giving himself up. So John Wilkes tells Dave Harold to get the hell out of there and give himself up. He yells to the soldiers outside, "There is a man in here who wants to surrender awful bad." And the soldiers weren't sure if they wanted to let Dave Harold surrender or not. They kept demanding that the weapons be handed out, but John Wilkes was not going to let any of those weapons go. So Dave Harold was pissing his pants for a second when he was trying to leave the barn and the soldiers kept asking for weapons.
Then, there is a man in here who wishes we surrender awful bad.
Let him hand out his arms. You carry a carbine and you must out.
The last thing John Wilkes says to Dave Harold before he surrenders is, "Do not tell them what arms I have." And that's crazy because, of course, the soldiers know that he has arms. I mean, come on, everybody has arms, right? Right? Naturally, Dave Harold was manhandled as roughly as you can imagine after he was finally able to surrender to the Union troops. Some conspiracy theorists will claim that Dave Harold came out of the barn calling John Wilkes by the name of Boyd, or whatever the fuck, but I don't buy any of that. Anything Dave Harold said when he surrendered needs to be taken with a big old grain of salt, because he was trying to save his own neck, and he would have said absolutely anything if he thought it might have helped him survive. And Dave Harold was a talker. Let me tell you what. He would talk the ears off of his captors if they allowed him to. Dave Harold was more clever than most people give him credit for. Moving on. After Dave's surrender, I'm sure John Wilkes Booth was starting to shit his pants at least a little bit now that he was all alone. I mean, who am I kidding? He was shitting his pants a lot. He was surrounded, he could barely walk, and he could barely carry a weapon without falling over, let alone engaging in any form of meaningful combat. So I think it's safe to say that John Wilkes Booth knew that he was kind of fucked. He was as frail as a babe in swaddling clothes. And yet, he wanted to have a standoff with the dick-swinging Union just after they have finished laying pipe all across the South in the form of Sherman's Scourge of Georgia and the murderous pragmatism of General Grant. Like, John Wilkes Booth was just out of his depth, and he did not realize the scope of his situation. All he knew was that his life was forfeit and that he did not want to be paraded through the streets of D.C., only to end up decorating a scaffold after the farcical trial was all over with. That's not something John Wilkes wanted to be a part of. Because let's be honest, the military court that they used to try the conspirators was bullshit, but more on that later on. John Wilkes had read the newspapers provided by Thomas Jones, and he knew full well that he was not going to get a fair day in court. So he initiated a standoff with the Army, and the Army was led by an incompetent lieutenant who played into that standoff when they could have just stormed the barn and forced John Wilkes to submission. Like, this could have gone so differently if the people on command at the scene at the time had just done their fucking jobs. I can't stress that enough. But because they wanted to dick around, the standoff lasted for quite a few hours, with John Wilkes and Lieutenant Doherty going back and forth many times. John Wilkes begged Lieutenant Doherty to fight him one-on-one, or to back off the troops so John Wilkes could have a fighting chance at beating the army and escaping. It's hilarious to even say that. Honestly, John Wilkes was out of his mind for asking for such stupid favors, and Lieutenant Doherty was out of his mind for dithering so long and dragging all of this shit out for so goddamn long. Finally, towards the end of the night, probably around 4 a.m., Lieutenant Doherty ordered that the barn be lit on fire to force John Wilkes Booth out of it. I feel like I have to remind you, though, that this entire time, Lieutenant Doherty could have just ordered a sweep and clear of the barn at any goddamn moment. I'm very frustrated by the fact that he didn't. I understand why he denied Boston Corbett's request to go in after Booth, but he still should have ordered his own breaching maneuver. The fact that Lieutenant Doherty was never really criticized for his dereliction of duty is somewhat puzzling, so I've decided to bring some attention to this obvious failure to act. He was the commander on scene that night, and he should have ordered his men to go in and pull John Wilkes out of there, instead of lighting the barn on fire like a bunch of pansies, let alone the hours of needless bickering between Lieutenant Doherty and John Wilkes. As the soldiers were lighting the fires around the barn, John Wilkes would threaten to shoot one of the soldiers that got too close to the barn. John Wilkes would lean in close and whisper threateningly to the man trying to light the barn on fire, and he told him that he was going to shoot him if he didn't back away from the barn. But the other soldiers were able to get the job done, and the barn lit up like a pagan winter solstice day tree in Times Square. The flames created a clear image of John Wilkes on the inside, making him the best target that side of the Rappahannock River. So when John Wilkes was about to come charging out, right before he could put on his final performance for the world, Boston Corbett used his sidearm to shoot John Wilkes Booth in the back of the neck before he could even fire a shot of his own. Boston Corbett's gun was the only one to be fired that night. John Wilkes Booth never fired a shot, and he never went out in a blaze of glory. He was shot in the back in a very similar way to how he shot Abraham Lincoln, by complete surprise and without any warning that it was going to happen. Karma has a way of coming full circle to people who act like John Wilkes Booth, and it also has a way of punishing people who do not deserve to be punished. But that's a whole different discussion entirely. After John Wilkes Booth was shot, he was still alive, but he could not move anything below his neck. Union soldiers had to go inside the burning barn to pull his limp body out of the growing inferno. And after the soldiers realized that John Wilkes Booth was still alive and could not move a muscle, the soldiers suddenly became very tender and caring towards the traitorous assassin that stole America's most beloved president. Perhaps it's just the natural tenderness that we all have towards those who are very soon going to be dead, because we all want to feel like we might get some compassion for ourselves if we ever are half dead lying on the ground. So the next few hours of John Wilkes' life were spent in the caring arms of Lieutenant Doherty and Detectives Baker and Conger and their soldiers. They tried to give John Wilkes some food and water, but he could no longer swallow anything that they put into his mouth. At least John Wilkes had an excuse for not being able to swallow anything. Broads be just prudes lately. I mean, step your shit up, dog. Anyway, I wonder how many times I've said the word anyway. And I wonder how many times I've commented on how many times I've said the word anyway. I get sidetracked a lot, and I suspect my videos will stay that way until I have someone reading these scripts after I write them. So for the millionth time, anyway, John Wilkes Booth was as limp as Nate Orlowick's wife every time they fuck. Or husband. Boston Corbett severed John Wilkes' spine when he shot him in the back of the neck. So John Wilkes was not going anywhere, and he wasn't going to be moving a muscle until he finally died. He could only talk slightly, and only in a gasping, withering tone that showed how painful it was for him to talk. Honestly, many people would say that the pain that John Wilkes was in was his just reward for killing such an important member of society at such a critical time. And I'm not sure I even disagree with those people. I mean, I don't wish pain on anybody if I can help it, but John Wilkes kind of asked for this, didn't he? The nightmare fuel chaos that consumed America after the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, might have been a whole hell of a lot more pleasant if we had had Abraham Lincoln to set America up on a good path after the Civil War. Or perhaps President Lincoln might have turned out to be even worse than the people he left behind if he had lived. So who knows for sure what might have happened. But I do know that John Wilkes Booth did deserve whatever whatever pain he felt in his final hours. The soldiers around him were tender and kind and caring, and they were interested to hear his final words. And that's way more than John Wilkes deserved. If John Wilkes had been any other skin color and had done what he did, he would have been paraded around at the end of a pike, screaming in agony for daring to threaten the white man's hegemony over America. But because John Wilkes was white, he was allowed to die in as much comfort and peace as nature would allow, which was very little, considering the injuries that he had taken. Lieutenant Doherty had made sure that someone wrote down John Wilkes' final words, and they continued to try to talk to him the whole time that he was laying on the Garrett family's front deck. He said to the soldiers, "Tell Mother I died for my country," except he said that in his wheezing, gasping tone that was a result of his injuries. The man always did have a flair for the dramatic, and he did love his mother very dearly, so I won't begrudge him his final statement. As the sun rose on April 26th, 1865, John Wilkes asked to see his hands. One of the soldiers lifted his hands close to his face so John could see them, and he uttered what would be his final words. "Useless. Useless." I think John Wilkes looked at his hands one last time as a form of accepting the fact that he would be paralyzed even if he did live. So he might as well just lay back and die. I mean no disrespect towards the people who are paralyzed, but I can sort of see how someone could come to that conclusion in their final moments. Why bother fighting on and worrying when you won't be able to move so much as a muscle or even swallow if you do live? It might have been some kind of cathartic peace knowing that, well, this is it. I can just lay back and go. John Wilkes knew that he was a goner, and he wanted to make sure by looking at his limp-ass hands. Or maybe it was for some totally different reason. I don't know. I'm just reading you what the articles I read told me. And this particular article right here that I read, that will be linked in the sources list below, made the claim that John Wilkes' final words had something to do with Willie Jett. An officer who was supposedly there made an account where he said John Wilkes Booth heard Willie Jett's name being mentioned just before he died, and that his final words were actually, "Did Jett betray me?" And this is supposed to have happened after the comments about John's hands, which were his official last words. So I leave it to you, dear viewer, to decide which version you like better. The only thing that really matters is that John Wilkes Booth died at 7:22 a.m., April 26th, 1865. Coincidentally, Abraham Lincoln had also died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, 1865. They both died as the sun rose, at the exact same minute. I don't even pretend to know if that means a goddamn thing or not. Most likely it's just a coincidence, as with so many other things in life. But I wouldn't be upset with you if you decided to call their mutual time of death a matter of fate, or karma, or whatever. It just as easily could be. All I know right now is that this chapter is over, and with it, this video, pretty much. There is still the aftermath chapter to go through, which will be pretty long, but this is pretty much it for the story of John Wilkes Booth. He was dead, and there was nothing more to discuss. I'm not even going to entertain the idea that he lived on, because it would expand the scope of this video so much that my mind would explode from having to work on this for any longer than I absolutely need to. I have been working tirelessly on this video, and I am ready to move on to the next one. So there you are, dear viewer. That is the story of John Wilkes Booth. Perhaps someday we'll talk about the conspiracy, but since I don't believe in it one bit, I doubt I'm ever really going to go there. And honestly, I think you guys should drop it too, because the conspiracy just doesn't really add up when you really look at it. And that's the last thing I'm going to say on it, because I'm going to end this chapter right here and shut my goddamn mouth before I make this any longer. So, toodaloo, motherfucker. I'll see you in the aftermath chapter if you decide to stick around. I'm going to try to get through this last chapter as quickly as possible. After John Wilkes Booth was shot like a rabid dog in the street, his withered, half-starved body was collected and brought to the USS Montauk, a Monitor-class warship that acted as a temporary command base for the military units that were looking for John Wilkes. A rather large group of doctors performed the autopsy on the deck of the Montauk. Dr. John Frederick May identified the body from a scar that was on the back of John's neck. from a small tumor that the doctor had removed a few months earlier. John Wilkes's body had looked quite different than what he did a few months prior, but there was no arguing with the doctor's identification. I know conspiracy theorists like to argue about whether or not Dr. May positively identified John Wilkes's body, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. That's just too big of a subject, and I'm simply not on the side of the conspiracy theorists. I think John Wilkes Booth was put down like a rabid animal in the Garrett barn on April 26, 1865. I don't think that he survived, and I think any of those stories that say that he did are full of shit start to finish. So let's leave it at that and move on, so that we can end this video and so I can talk about somebody else. I'm not going to get into the trial of the conspirators too much either, because that's a long story in and of itself. Suffice it to say that the main group of the conspirators were unceremoniously hanged in the Navy Yard base courtyard in Washington, D.C. They had a trial, and it was a lengthy process by the standards of the time, but it was fucking quick by today's standards. And there was all sorts of injustices that happened at the trial, and I could go on and on about things I disagreed with about the trial. But that's just not a conversation to have right now. Lewis Powell, Dave Harold, George Azarat, and Mary Surratt all had their necks stretched for their involvement in the assassination. Personally, I think they were all guilty as the day is long, but I doubt they would have all gotten death sentences if they had been tried in a civilian court. That's all I'm going to say about that right now. Michael O'Loughlin and Samuel Arnold and Samuel Mudd would all receive life sentences in a tropical work prison in the Dry Tortugas, but they would be released from prison in 1869 when Andrew Dickhead Johnson pardoned Sam Arnold and Samuel Mudd for their crimes. Michael O'Loughlin had died of a yellow fever outbreak during their stay in prison. Edmund Spangler got 6 years in jail for his very small part in the assassination, and many would claim that his sentence is probably the most unjust out of all the people who were sentenced, because he really didn't have much to do with the assassination, and I doubt that he really knew what was going on. But he might have, who knows. Over 50 people would be arrested by the government on suspicion of involvement of the assassination, but they were all let go when there was not enough evidence to charge most of them. 2 of John Wilkes's brothers would be arrested and questioned and later let go because of what John Wilkes did, along with Asia Booth's husband, John Sleeper Clark. They would all get arrested by the government and questioned quite heavily, and John Sleeper Clark would be bitter and resentful for the rest of his life over this whole ordeal, and he would grow to resent everything Booth-related later on, including his wife, Asia Booth, which was John's sister. And it all stemmed from him being arrested in connection with the assassination. He was always jealous that Edwin Booth, the most successful member of the Booth family, was never arrested or questioned at all by the government when all of this came crashing down. John Sleeper Clark thought that he was too good to be arrested with the rest of the rabble, and he resented everybody for having to go through that ordeal. Asia Booth would eventually write a book about her murderous brother. She waited until her husband was dead, until everybody who would have been hurt by it was no longer around, but her account would be riddled with biases all along the way, and it would be full of lost cause rhetoric. But there was plenty of valuable information in her book that historians were able to gather all kinds of information about John Wilkes from Asia's writings. So it's not like there's no value to it, it's just that Asia Booth was heavily skewed in the wrong direction when it came to the lost cause mythology, and so her writings are, significantly less valuable because of it. John Wilkes's brother Edwin would promise to retire from acting for good in the wake of Lincoln's assassination as a penance for his brother's crimes, but he would be back on stage within 6 months, performing the same play that Lincoln was watching when he was murdered by John Wilkes, Our American Cousin.
I'm back. Everybody relax. I'm doing Our American Cousin. I know that's the one that my brother assassinated Abraham Lincoln during. But that's what I'm gonna do. And everyone loves it. And he's back because he's kind of egotistical.
Edwin was basically the king of being tone deaf. The guy didn't care about nothing except what he wanted. And he wanted to act, so his promises didn't mean jack shit. Edwin Booth would never speak his younger brother's name again in public, but he would keep a photo of his younger brother above his bedside until the day he died. So you can't say that he completely abandoned his brother. I don't know whether or not I can condemn Edwin Booth for having some affection for his brother despite his crimes. I mean, family's family at the end of the day. You can't, life is hard and it's complicated. I don't know. As for John Wilkes' body, eventually, after everything calmed down and the country was no longer seeing red, John Wilkes' body was released from the prison yard where it was buried, and it was given back to the Booth family so they could bury John with the rest of his family. Whether or not he deserved that kindness, I don't know, but that's what happened. But what matters right now is that this video is pretty much over and done with. Going into any more detail would overly extend the length of this video, and I don't want to do that. So be sure to subscribe to my channel, pretty please, because my life force is directly tied to the amount of subscribers I have, so I'm hoping you guys will help me out. Also, be sure to like this video and share it with anyone that you think might enjoy it. And also give me a couple bucks on Patreon so I can get better sound equipment and hire a script editor so I can trim down the length of my videos. I'll do my best next time to keep the video as short as possible, but, no promises. John Wilkes turned out to be a bigger subject than I expected him to be, and there's plenty of other history subjects out there that I plan on covering who are also going to end up being a gigantic subject. And I'm not going to shy away from taking those projects on, but I think I'm going to stick with the short projects for a little while. Unless, of course, this video does super well, and then maybe I might do something a bit bigger. I don't know. We'll see. Or let me know in the comments down below what you think I should do next. Should I take on a bigger project, or should I do something short? Do you guys like the longer videos, or do you want something a little bit shorter? I know what my friends think. They've told me multiple times, but I'm hoping that the rest of you guys out there can let me know. All right, that's all I got. Stay exactly where you are until I release my next video. Like, don't you move an inch. You hear me? Don't move. Stay right where you are, and I'll be back in maybe about a month or so. Hopefully less. We'll see. I don't know. No promises. It might be longer. All right, that's it. Bye-bye now. Don't move.
John Wilkes Booth shot President Lincoln, and a few Southern rebels helped him. Nobody else. As far as I'm concerned, the case should be closed.